The first thing he felt was the cold. Not the kind of cold you feel when you've left your jacket in the car. The kind of cold that bites into your bones from the inside and tells you that you're already dead, you just haven't fallen yet. Kyle North opened his eyes and saw a gray sky. Snow was falling thick and heavy. He was standing in the middle of a village square in a body that wasn't his own. His arms were skinny, his ribs jutted out from under a torn shirt. His legs were bandaged. No boots, no gloves. 20 below. He knew it right away, because at 20 below, the hairs in your nose freeze on the very first breath. 3 years in the Mountain Search and Rescue Service had taught him to gauge the temperature more accurately than a thermometer. A crowd had gathered around him, about 40 people, all clad in animal skins and tanned sheepskin coats. Everyone was staring at him. No one looked at him with pity. The village elder stood before him, a burly man with a beard frosted with hoarfrost and eyes the color of frozen mud. He spat at Kyle's feet. The spit froze mid-air and fell onto the snow like a brown pea. The village headman said that, according to the royal edict on the preservation of the lineage, every man in the northern villages was required to take between 2 and 5 wives. He said that these 4 now belonged to Kayla. He said that if he refused, his property would be confiscated and he would be sent to a labor camp. The crowd roared with laughter. Kyle had no property. Kyle didn't even have a pair of pants in one piece. A labor camp meant the salt mines, where the average lifespan was 4 months. The village elder turned and walked away. The crowd followed him. And Kyle was left alone in the square with 4 women who looked at him as if he were the 5th misfortune in their already cursed lives. The first one stood closest to him. She was thin to the point of transparency. Her skin was gray. Her eyes were sunken. She was coughing into her fist, and there were pink spots on the snow beneath her feet. A herbalist. Kyle had seen that kind of cough before. Not tuberculosis, pneumonia. A fever close to 40. She needed hot broth right now, not in an hour. The second woman stood slightly to the side, short, wiry, a bow on her back, a quiver with 3 arrows. She wasn't looking at Kyle. She was watching the crowd as it dispersed. She watched like a predator, memorizing where everyone was standing just in case she had to shoot. Her fingers were blue. 2nd-degree frostbite. With fingers like that, she couldn't draw the bow right now, but she wouldn't throw it away either, because the bow was the only thing she had left. A mute hunter. Kyle realized this from the way she moved her lips without making a sound. The third one was sitting right in the snow. Small, dark-skinned, not from around here. She was smiling. The smile was so wide and so empty that it made Kyle's teeth clench. That's how people smile who've spent 12 years smiling under the lash, because they were beaten harder if they didn't smile. The edge of a brand peeked out from under a torn rag on her left shoulder. A rose, the mark of a brothel in the southern province. A runaway slave. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Kyle could tell by the way she was sitting. Her body was conserving energy. Her muscles were completely relaxed. Her eyes followed everyone, but her head didn't turn. She couldn't be given too much food at once. Intestinal obstruction would kill her faster than the cold. The fourth woman stood furthest away. Her back was straight, her chin was up. Her hair was tied in a bun. Her clothes were torn but clean. She looked at Kyle as if she'd already seen his corpse and was calculating how much firewood the funeral pyre would require. The traitor's daughter. Kyle knew this because fragments of his former body's memory were surfacing. Count Marsh, executed for treason 8 years ago. His daughter was cast out into the world. She was the only one of the 4 who looked well-fed. That meant she had something stashed away. And now she was testing to see if he would take it from her. He won't take it. A message flashed through Kyle's mind. The letters glowed before his eyes with a cold blue light. The hearth system has been activated. 4 candidates for the family have been detected. Bring them under the roof before sunset to earn first rank. Kyle looked up at the sky. The gray sun hung low. An hour until sunset, maybe an hour and a half. He looked at the 4 women. The herbalist was coughing. The huntress was silent. The slave was smiling. The traitor's daughter was waiting. Kyle said one word. "Let's go." No one moved. He didn't repeat himself. He turned and walked toward the edge of the village, to where the dugout of the former Kyle North had stood. That very same village fool nicknamed Empty Stomach. The one who had lived in a hole for 18 years and gone hungry his entire childhood. Kyle walked and counted. There was enough firewood in the dugout for 2 hours. He remembered this from his body's memory. No food, no water, only snow. But snow is water if you have something to melt it with. He needed a fire. He needed a pot. He needed this hole to smell like food, not death, in an hour. Everything else could wait. Footsteps behind him. He didn't turn around. The slave came first. She was used to following someone. Then the herbalist. She didn't care where she went because she thought she'd die anyway. Then the hunter. She didn't follow Kyle. She followed the herbalist because the herbalist was staggering and might fall. Last came the traitor's daughter. She walked slowly. She walked deliberately. She walked because staying in the square was worse. The dugout turned out to be worse than Kyle had expected. A pit 2 by 3 meters, the walls were smeared with clay. The ceiling was made of poles and turf. The door consisted of 3 planks tied together with rope. Inside, it was -15. There was straw on the floor. In the corner were 2 clay pots. One had a crack. Next to them was a cauldron, made of iron, old, without a handle, but intact. Kyle went in first. He looked around. 3 seconds. His brain was working like a kitchen during rush hour. Pots, a cauldron, wood chips from the poles, dry moss in the cracks of the wall. He began building a rocket stove. 2 pots. One is placed on its side. A fire is lit inside it. The second is placed on top at an angle. This creates draft. Moss and wood chips for kindling. Thin firewood. It burns quickly but hot. 3 times more efficient than an open fire. Kyle used to make these in the mountains when a rescue team got stranded overnight without a tent. The women stood at the entrance. They watched. The healer leaned against the wall and slid down. The huntress grabbed her by the shoulder. The slave was already smiling at the walls. The traitor's daughter watched what Kyle was doing, and for the first time all day, her eyes showed interest rather than contempt. The fire caught on at the first try. Kyle exhaled. He set the pot on top. He filled it with snow. The snow began to melt. Now for the food. He turned to the traitor's daughter. He looked her in the eyes. He said he knew she had barley. He said he wouldn't take it all. He said he'd ask for a handful, just one, for all of them. She was silent for 10 seconds. Then she pulled a small bag from her bosom. She tossed it to him. A handful of barley. 80 grams. For 5 people, that was nothing. But Kyle was a cook. He knew what to do with nothing. They found some dried meat in the corner of the dugout, a piece the size of a palm, tough as a shoe sole. The old Kyle had either forgotten about it or was saving it. The new Kyle tossed the whole thing into the pot. The water began to cloud over. A faint but distinct smell filled the air. Then barley. Then Kyle walked over to the herbalist. She was sitting on the straw, shivering. She had a bag on her belt. He asked if it was okay. She nodded. He opened the bag. Inside were bundles of dried herbs. He found some thyme. He rubbed it between his fingers. He tossed a pinch into the cauldron. He said it was for her cough. She looked at him as if he'd said something in a language she didn't know. Then he stepped outside for a second. He plucked a handful of pine needles from the nearest pine tree. He crushed them. He tossed them into the pot. He turned to the huntress. He said the pine needles were for scurvy. He said her gums were bleeding and he'd noticed it. She didn't say anything. She couldn't say anything. But her eyes had changed. The slave sat in the corner and smiled. Kyle walked over to her. He took a lump of fat out of the pocket of his former body. Mutton fat. Rancid, but fat nonetheless. He dropped a spoonful into the pot. He said she shouldn't eat anything solid. He said liquid fat would warm her up faster. She smiled even wider. But something in her eyes flickered. Something alive beneath 12 years of a dead smile. The traitor's daughter was hiding a pinch of salt behind her cheek. Kyle saw her roll it around with her tongue. He said that salt in hot broth works better than salt in your mouth. He said she was salty enough as it was.
For a second, it seemed to him that the corner of her lips twitched. Not a smile, a shadow of a smile.
She spat the salt into the pot. 40 minutes later, the temperature in the dugout was +8. Kyle knew this because at +8, the snow on the walls starts to thaw but doesn't run. The broth was ready. Watery. Murky. It smelled of thyme and pine needles and barley and something that can't be named with a word but can be described warmth. There was only one bowl. Kyle poured the first serving and handed it to the herbalist. She drank in small sips. Her cough hadn't stopped, but it had eased. Then the bowl was passed to the slave girl. Kyle gave her half a serving. She looked at him. He said there would be more tomorrow. She nodded. The huntress drank while standing, with one hand. She pressed the other to her chest. Her fingers. Kyle thought he'd have to give her a warm compress and a massage tomorrow. If her fingers froze off, she'd lose her bow, and the bow was the only weapon in this house. The traitor's daughter drank last. She drank slowly. She drank with her eyes closed. When she opened them, Kyle saw that they were wet. She quickly turned away.
None of them understood why she was crying.
Kyle understood. He'd seen it in the mountains. When a person is freezing and has already resigned themselves to death, and then someone brings something hot, the body relaxes. The body says, "You can live." And everything that's been building up inside comes out through the eyes. Letters flashed in Kyle's mind again. The hearth system, rank 1, hearth for all family members, daily lottery unlocked. Tomorrow at dawn, you'll receive your first ticket. The warmth scale, Maeve Ashdown, 8, Una So, 10, Ren Valenza, 13, Astrid Marsh, 3. Kyle looked at the numbers. Ren, the slave, had the highest score. She was grateful for every little bit. Una, the hunter, was at 10. Exactly 10. The system said that at 10, the greatest fear is unleashed. Astrid was at 3. She gave barley and salt, but didn't give her trust. That's normal. Trust can't be bought with a bowl of broth. Kyle lay down on the straw by the door, farther from the fire than anyone else, closest to the draft. The 4 women were lying closer to the stove. The herbalist was already asleep. Her breathing was heavy but steady. The hunter lay with her eyes open.
She was looking at Kyle.
He didn't look away. She was the first to look away. The slave girl was curled up in a ball in the corner. The smile had finally slipped from her face. In her sleep, she looked her 19 years. The traitor's daughter lay on her back. Kyle knew there was a knife under her jacket. He knew she wasn't asleep. He knew she was waiting. Waiting for him to get up and approach one of them at night. Because every man she'd ever known would come to her at night, sooner or later. Kyle closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about women. He was thinking about 41 days. In 41 days, the tax collector would arrive. A sack of grain, 4 hides, an iron ingot. He has neither grain, nor hides, nor iron. If he doesn't pay the tax, the village head will take everything. His wives will be sent to the government convoy, 3 to the brothel at the garrison, the traitor's daughter to the gallows, himself to the salt mines. 41 days, minus 20 behind the wall, 2 handfuls of barley, 3 arrows, 1 cauldron, 4 women who don't know him, 1 system he doesn't understand, and 0 chances according to every living creature within a 100-mile radius. Kyle North closed his eyes and thought, "All right, it's been worse." Then he thought, "No, it hasn't." Then he thought,
So this is going to be interesting. He fell asleep in 30 seconds. A cook knows how to fall asleep quickly. The shift starts at 5 in the morning. Kyle woke up from the cold. The stove had gone out. It was -5 in the dugout. He knew this because his breath was coming out as steam, but his eyebrows weren't frosted yet. Gray light seeped through the cracks in the door. Dawn. Letters flashed in his mind. The hearth's daily lot. Family's total heat, 34. Result? Yeast. Dry, 200 grams. It appeared right in his hand, a small canvas pouch. Inside was powder, beige, smelling of bread. Kyle clenched the bag in his fist and sat down on the straw. Yeast. In a world where there is no yeast. In a world where bread is a bland, flat bread made of flour and water, if there's any flour at all. Yeast isn't just an ingredient. Yeast is civilization. It's bread that rises. It's dough that lives. It's a scent that awakens something ancient and warm deep inside a person's stomach. Kyle knew the value of yeast. At the restaurant, he'd been cultivating his own sourdough starter for 3 years. He fed it flour every day. He called it Barbara. When Barbara died because an intern forgot her in the fridge over the weekend, Kyle didn't speak to him for a week. Now he was holding dry yeast in his hand. 200 grams. That's enough to start a sourdough starter that, with proper care, will live forever. But a sourdough starter needs flour. Flour needs grain. There's no grain. There's barley, a handful, given to him yesterday by the traitor's daughter. Kyle looked at the pot. At the bottom lay the dregs from yesterday's porridge, barley porridge, boiled down to a glue-like consistency. He carefully scooped it out, 40 grams. He kneaded it between his fingers, added a pinch of yeast, mixed it, placed it in a small pot, covered it with a cloth, set it against the wall where it was warmer. If the mixture rises by evening, he'll have a starter. If the starter survives the night, he'll be able to bake tomorrow. But he has nothing to bake with. He needs grain. He looked at the sleeping women. Maeve, the herbalist, was breathing a little easier. The broth had done its job. The fever hadn't gone away, but her cough had become less frequent. She needs one more day of hot drinks and warmth. Then it will be possible to tell how deep the illness runs. The hunter Una lay on her side. Her bow was within reach, even in her sleep. Her fingers were still blue. Kyle remembered that at a warmth level of 10, the system promised to reveal one's greatest fear. Una's level was exactly 10. That meant something was bound to happen. He didn't know exactly what. The slave Wren slept in the corner. There was no smile. In her sleep, her face was different, soft, childlike, without a mask. The brand on her shoulder was visible through a tear in the rag, a rose the size of a fist. The skin around it was bumpy. She'd been branded with a red-hot iron. She was 7 when they did it. Kyle looked away. Astrid was lying on her back with her eyes open. She wasn't asleep. Maybe she hadn't slept all night. She was looking at Kyle and waiting. He showed her the little bag of yeast. He said it had appeared out of nowhere. He said it was yeast. She asked what yeast was. He said it was what made bread soft. She said there's no such thing as soft bread. Bread is a rock that you soak in water. Kyle said that in 2 days she'd find out what was possible. Astrid sat down. She looked at him for a long time. She said that if he was a sorcerer, she'd leave. She said that one accusation of heresy would be enough for her for a lifetime. Kyle said he wasn't a sorcerer. He said he was a cook. She said she didn't see the difference. Maeve was the first to wake up. A cough roused her, a long, wet one. She sat on the straw, bent and coughed so hard the walls shook. Kyle walked over to her. He'd already stoked the stove. He'd already set the pot of snow on it. He'd brewed thyme from her bag, stronger than yesterday. He handed her a mug. She drank with both hands. Her hands were shaking, half of it spilled. She looked up at Kyle. Her eyes were green, dark, like bottle glass. She said he didn't need to waste time on her. She said there wasn't much time left. She said she'd die before spring anyway. Kyle said she wouldn't die. He said it so calmly that she fell silent. Not because she believed him, because no one had ever told her that before, without pity, without hope in their voice, as a fact, like the 20 below outside the wall. Kyle went out. He had to find food. He had 3 sources. First, traps. The old Kyle used to set snares for hares but never caught a single one because he set them wrong. The new Kyle knew how to set snares. His Norwegian grandfather had taught him when he was 12. Second, ice fishing. The river was 400 meters from the dugout. The ice was thick, but there were always fish under the ice. The problem was that he had neither a hook nor a fishing line. Third, pine bark, the inner layer. It was edible. It's not tasty, but it's high in calories. The Finns have been eating it for centuries. His grandfather told him so. Kyle chose all 3. He cut strips from the rope that held the door shut. Thin, flexible. He made 4 loops out of them. He found hare tracks 200 meters from the dugout. He set the snares, just right, with the approach leading onto the trail, with a stone as an anchor. Then he went to the river. Ice, thick, 30 centimeters. He couldn't chop a hole without an axe, but he didn't have an axe. He had a stone, sharp, flat. He struck the ice for 40 minutes. His hands went numb. The skin on his knuckles cracked. Blood froze on the stone. The hole turned out crooked, small, but it went all the way through. Black water below. Kyle pulled a thread from his shirt. He tied a splinter to it. He skewered a piece of yesterday's meat from the broth onto the splinter, about the size of a fingernail. He lowered it into the hole. He sat down on the ice. He waited. 20 below. The wind. He couldn't feel his fingers. He waited because he knew. The fish in the winter river were hungry. Hungrier than he was. 20 minutes later, the thread twitched. Kyle pulled. A fish hung at the end. Small. 150 grams. Gray with dark spots. Looked like a trout. He pulled it off the stick. It thrashed in his hand. He killed it quickly by smashing it against the ice. He cast it out again. Half an hour later, he had 3 fish, 400 grams in total. On the way back, he stripped the bark from 2 pine trees. He peeled off the inner bark. He gathered pine needles. He found a rosehip bush under the snow. The berries were dry, frozen, but it's vitamin C, for Una, for her gums. When he returned to the dugout, Una was standing at the entrance, with a bow. She looked at his hands, bloodied and bruised, then at the fish, then back at his hands. She gestured. "Give me the knife." Kyle pulled a stone shard from behind his belt, the one he used as a knife. She took the fish and began to clean it, silently, quickly, professionally. Scales flew into the snow, innards in one direction, fillets in the other. She filleted 3 fish in 4 minutes. Her hands moved with precision, despite her frostbitten fingers. She knew what she was doing. She'd done this 1,000 times. The system gave a hint. Una's skill was highlighted. Filleting, a quiet step, reading tracks. Kyle nodded. He already knew. Una handed him a fillet. Their fingers touched. Her fingers were icy. His were covered in blood. She looked him in the eyes, and he saw it. He didn't need to ask the system. He saw fear. Not fear of the cold, not fear of hunger. Fear of the voice. She was afraid to speak. Not because she couldn't, because on the day she screamed, the guards heard her and blocked the back entrance, and her father was taken away and executed. Her voice had killed her father. That's what she believed. That's how she'd lived for 6 years, in a silence that was not silence, but punishment. Kyle said nothing. He just took the fillet and went inside. Some things can't be healed with words. Some things are healed with fish in a hot pot and time. Inside, Maeve sat by the stove, sorting through her herbs. Wren was sweeping the floor with a bundle of straw. Astrid sat in the corner, counting. Kyle saw her move her lips. She was counting the days. He knew she was counting to 41, too. Kyle made fish broth, with pine needles, with rose hips, with pine bark which he'd cut into thin strips and boiled separately until it softened. It didn't look very appealing, a murky slurry with strips of bark floating in it. But it smelled of fish and resin and something warm. He poured it out into portions. Maeve got more broth and less solids. Wren got the liquid with a spoonful of fish fat. Una got the rose hips separately and the broth separately. Astrid got an equal portion, without any special treatment, because Astrid didn't need any special treatment. She just needed an equal portion. They ate in silence. Kyle ate last. He got the smallest portion of all. He didn't consider it a sacrifice. He considered it a distribution of resources. The cook eats after his shift, always. After the meal, Kyle checked the starter. The mass in the pot had risen by half a centimeter. The yeast was working, alive, even at -5. He added another pinch of barley porridge, stirred it, covered it. Tomorrow it would rise more. The day after tomorrow he'd be able to bake, if he could find flour, if he could find grain. Kyle checked the snares before going to bed. Empty. That's normal. The first day rarely yields results. The hares need to get used to the scent. On the way back, he passed by the village headman's house, a large log cabin, smoke from the chimney, the smell of roasted meat. Derek was watching. The village headman's nephew, 26 years old, broad-shouldered, well-fed, a smirk on his face. He told Kyle he'd seen smoke coming from his den. Said that smoking without the village head's permission was forbidden. Said that if Kyle lit another smoky fire, he'd come personally and douse it with snow. Kyle looked at Derek. He remembered that Derek had been Astrid's suitor before her father was executed. He remembered that when the Marshies fell, Derek was the first to turn his back. Kyle didn't say anything. He turned and walked back. Derek called after him that the Lord of the Outcasts wouldn't last long. Kyle didn't turn around. It was 3 degrees above zero in the dugout. The stove was burning steadily. Maeve was asleep. Wren was washing rags in melted snow. Una was sharpening arrows with a stone. Astrid was writing something on a strip of birch bark with a charred stick. Kyle lay down by the door. He was thinking about tomorrow. He needed grain. Without grain, there would be no bread. Without bread, there would be no calories. Without calories, the herbalist would die in a week. In 2 weeks, the rest would die. In 3 weeks, he would die. Grain. Where could he get grain in a village where grain was worth its weight in silver? Kyle closed his eyes. He knew where. He'd seen it in the square. Behind the village headman's house stood a granary. A lock on the door. Grain inside. Not for the village, for taxes. The village headman had been hoarding it all year. He couldn't steal it. If caught, he'd be hanged. So he had to earn it. He had to give the village head what he wanted more than grain. Kyle thought. What did the village head, Magnus Ook, want more than grain? Power. No, he already had power. Respect. No, he doesn't care about respect. Safety. Yes, the village head is afraid. Afraid of hungry gangs from the east. Afraid that the village won't survive the winter and he'll be hanged instead of the next village head. Afraid that officials from the county will arrive and find the village empty. He needs warmth, not in a figurative sense, literally. He needs the houses to stay lit. He needs smoke to rise from the chimneys. He needs the village to look alive when the tax collector arrives. Kyle opened his eyes. He knew what to do. Tomorrow he'd go to the village head and propose a deal. The morning of the 3rd day began with a drawing of lots. Total heat, 39. The result? Salt. Rock salt. 300 grams. The little bag appeared in Kyle's hand, just like yesterday, out of nowhere, warm. Kyle untied it and sniffed it. Pure salt. No impurities. In this world, salt was worth its weight in silver. 300 grams was a week's worth of food for a family of 5, or currency, or a bargaining chip. Kyle tucked the little bag into his shirt and stepped out of the dugout. The frost was biting, -22. The sky was gray, the sun was dim, like a light bulb behind a dirty pane. He was heading toward the village headman's house. Along the way, he checked the snares. One had a hare in it, frozen, dead.
It had suffocated during the night. Kyle took it out. The carcass weighed 700 grams. That's a lot. By local standards, that's a fortune. He hung the hare from his belt and kept walking. The village headman's house stood in the center of the village. A log cabin, 2 stories, smoke rising from the chimney. Derek was sitting by the door, gnawing on a frozen bone. He saw Kyle and stood up. He stood so as to block the doorway. Kyle said he needed to see the village headman. Derek said the village headman didn't need Kyle. Kyle took out the hare and showed it to him. Derek looked at the hare, then at Kyle, then back at the hare. He went inside. A minute later, the village headman came out. Magnus Oak, 54 years old, a beard down to his chest, tired eyes, not angry, just tired. He looked at the hare in Kyle's hands. He asked what Kyle wanted. Kyle said he wanted to propose a trade, a hare for a sack of barley. The village headman laughed. He said a sack of barley was worth 3 hares. Kyle said he knew that. He said the hare wasn't payment. A hare is just a sample. Kyle said he could catch 2 hares a day. He said that in a week he could give the village head 10 pelts. He said that 10 winter hare pelts were more than the 4 pelts needed for the tax. The village headman stopped laughing. He looked at Kyle and thought. Kyle could see him thinking. The village headman did the math. If this boy could really catch 2 hares a day, that would be 20 hares by the end of the month. 20 pelts. 10 of them could be handed over as tax, and 10 could be sold to the county furrier for bothy and iron. The village headman asked how Kyle was going to catch 2 hares a day. Before, he hadn't caught a single one all winter. Kyle said that he used to set his snares incorrectly. Now he sets them correctly. Here's the proof. He held up a hare. The village headman was silent. Then he said he would give him half a sack of barley. Not a whole sack. Half a sack. If Kyle brought in 2 more hares in 3 days, he'd get the other half. Kyle agreed. He took the half sack of barley and headed back. Behind him, Derek was saying something to the village headman. Derek's voice sounded angry. Kyle didn't turn around. Half a sack of barley. 2 grams. That would be enough for 5 days of porridge. Or 3 days of porridge and 2 attempts at baking bread. Kyle chose the bread. In the dugout, Maeve sat by the stove, sorting through herbs. Her cough had become less frequent overnight. Not because the illness had receded, but because the thyme and hot broth had reduced the inflammation in her. Her lungs were still sore. She needed fat. Lots of fat. Fish or animal fat. Fat is fuel for the body as it fights off infection. Kyle placed the barley by the stove. Maeve looked at the sack. Her eyes grew wide. She said she hadn't seen that much barley since last fall. Kyle said this was just the beginning. She looked at him with the same expression she'd had yesterday, as if he were speaking a foreign language, but speaking with such confidence that she wanted to believe him even without understanding. Kyle ground the barley with stones, 2 flat stones, one on the bottom and one on top. He ground it for half an hour. His hands were burning. The flour turned out coarse, with husks. Not white, but gray. But it was flour. He took the sourdough starter from the pot. Overnight, it had risen 2 centimeters. Alive. Active. It smelled sour and warm. He mixed the flour with the starter. He added water. A pinch of salt from that morning's ration. He kneaded the dough. His hands knew what to do. These hands had kneaded dough 1,000 times. Not these hands. Those. From a past life. But muscle memory came from somewhere deeper than the muscles. The dough was coarse, sticky, ugly, but alive. The yeast was working. He could feel the dough breathing beneath his fingers. He left it by the stove for 2 hours, covered it with a cloth. 2 hours later, the dough had risen. Not much, about 3 centimeters, but it had risen. In a world where bread doesn't rise, 3 centimeters is a miracle. An oven. He didn't have an oven, just a makeshift contraption made from 2 pots. Kyle thought for a moment. Then he picked up a flat stone. He heated it over the fire, very hot, until a drop of water sizzled and evaporated in a second. He placed the dough on the stone. He covered it with a pot turned upside down, an improvised oven. Heat from below from the stone, heat from above from the red-hot pot. An enclosed space, steam inside. 20 minutes. The smell started after 10. At first it was faint, a flowery scent. Then it grew richer, warmer. Then it became that scent that makes people's knees go weak, the smell of fresh bread. Maeve stopped coughing. She sat there, staring at the upside-down pot and breathing it in. Rin stood by the wall. A smile was still on her face, but her hands were trembling. Yuna came in from the street. She'd been hunting. 3 arrows. She'd returned empty-handed, but with a bunch of wild onions she'd found under the snow on the southern slope. She froze in the doorway. The scent hit her in the face. She took a step inside and stopped. Astrid was sitting in the corner, birch bark notes on her lap. She had been counting something. She stopped counting. Kyle took the pot off the fire. Bread lay on a rock, small, about the size of 2 fists. The crust was dark, cracked, ugly, crooked, but risen, soft on the inside. Kyle broke it open. Steam rose from within. 5 pieces. He handed them out. Maeve took her piece with both hands. She brought it to her face. She closed her eyes. She inhaled, took a bite, chewed slowly, eyes closed. A tear rolled down her cheek. She said it was the kindest thing she'd ever eaten. Her voice was quiet, broken, like that of someone who hadn't said anything nice out loud in 6 years. The system issued a notification. Maeve Ashdown +7 warmth. Current value 15. Skill unlocked. Sourdough starter. Maeve Ashdown can maintain a sourdough starter without losing its activity. Fermentation speed +20%. Kyle looked at Maeve. She didn't know about the system. She couldn't see the numbers. But she was already holding the pot of sourdough starter in her hands and sniffing it the way a herbalist sniffs a new plant, with professional interest. She said it smelled like mushrooms after the rain. Kyle said that's exactly what they were, in a way. She looked at him, for the first time without a shadow of death in her eyes, with curiosity. Ren was eating bread in small bites, as if she were afraid it would run out, as if eating slowly would make it last longer. Yuna ate standing up, with one hand, the other on her bow. She chewed and looked at Kyle, not at the bread, at Kyle. Astrid ate with her eyes closed, like Maeve, but for a different reason. Maeve closed her eyes out of pleasure. Astrid closed her eyes because she didn't want anyone to see what she was feeling. Kyle ate his piece last. The bread was coarse, with husks, sour, dense. By the standards of his restaurant, it was garbage. By the standards of this world, it was impossible. The smell of the bread seeped out through the cracks in the door. The smell spread through the village. Kyle knew this would happen. He knew that the smell travels farther in the frosty air than it does in the summer. The molecules moved more slowly, but the nose was keener. An hour later, a woman came to the dugout, his neighbor's wife, thin, with a child in her arms. She stood at the door, hesitating to knock. Kyle came out himself. She asked what the smell was. He said it was bread. She said bread doesn't smell like that. He said this one does. She stood there looking at him, and the child in her arms reached toward the door. Kyle went back inside. He cut off a finger-sized piece from his portion. He brought it out. He gave it to the child. The woman watched as her child ate the bread. Then she looked at Kyle. She didn't say anything. She left. Kyle knew that by evening the whole village would know. By evening, Derek would know too. On the 4th day, Kyle caught 2 hares. On the 5th, 2 more. He took them to the village headman and received the second half of the sack of barley. The village headman took the hares without a word. Derek stood behind him and looked at Kyle as if he had stolen something that belonged to him personally. On the 6th day, Kyle began smoking the meat. He found a pit behind the dugout. An old one. Maybe a cellar. Maybe a grave. It didn't matter. He widened it, deepened it, lined it with stones, made a grate out of willow twigs. At the bottom, he built a fire with damp alder wood. Alder produces thick smoke, cold and without bitterness. Kyle knew this because his grandfather smoked salmon only with alder and nothing other. He placed the first batch in the pit on the evening of the 6th day. 4 fish fillets, 2 pieces of hare meat, a strip of bast bark as a test. He covered the pit with a hide. The smoke rose slowly and steadily. By the morning of the 7th day, the fish was ready, golden, firm, with a scent that Kyle hadn't smelled from his past life. The scent of smoked fish in the winter air. For Kyle, it was the scent of his grandfather's shed in Portland. For the village, it was a scent no one had ever known. The smoke from the smokehouse drifted low, spreading across the snow. But the scent carried high and far. By noon, 8 people were standing by the dugout. They were just standing there, watching, sniffing. Children, 3 of them, barefoot, wrapped in rags, with faces older than their years. They stood closest of all. One girl, about 8 years old, red-headed, with freckles that looked like a scattering of rust on her white skin. She didn't ask for any. She just stood there, breathing it in as if she could get her fill of the scent. Kyle brought out the smoked lard. He'd rendered it from hare fat yesterday. Rendered it and mixed it with salt and thin shavings of smoked fish. The result was something between a pâté and lard. Unsightly, gray, but with a smell that made your stomach twist into a knot. He sliced it into thin pieces, placed them on a flat stone, carried the stone outside, set it down in front of the children, told them they could help themselves. The children didn't move. The red-headed girl looked at Kyle, then at the lard, then at her mother standing behind her. Her mother nodded. The girl took a piece. She took a bite. Her eyes went wide. She chewed and looked at Kyle as if he'd just pulled the sun out of his pocket. The other children followed her lead. Kyle cut and handed out more. The adults stood and watched. No one came forward. Adults in a starving village don't take food from strangers' hands. It's shameful. Children do. Children know no shame. They know hunger. At that moment, Derek came around the corner. 4 others were with him. Young, well-fed. The sons of those close to the village elder. Derek saw the crowd. He saw the children. He saw the stone with the food. He saw the smoke from the smokehouse. His face turned red. He walked up to Kyle. He said that smoking food without the village elder's permission was forbidden. He said that the smoke attracts bandits. He said he would confiscate everything he found. Kyle stood calmly. He had been expecting this. He knew Derek would come. He knew because the smell was a provocation, not accidental, but deliberate. Kyle had deliberately smoked the meat in an open pit rather than a closed one. He had deliberately let the smoke spread. He had deliberately brought the food outside. He needed this moment. Derek stepped toward the rock. He reached for the piece of bacon. The red-headed girl stood nearby. She was eating her second piece. Derek said it was confiscated. He took the rock with the bacon. He lifted it up. The girl looked up at him. She finished her piece. She licked her fingers. And she said one sentence. "He's mean, but you're worse." 8 years old, freckles, a voice as thin and clear as a thread. Derek froze. The crowd froze. The 4 behind Derek froze. The little red-haired girl stood between Derek and the rock holding the food, looking at him the way only children know how to look at adults who are doing something wrong. Without fear, without calculation, with absolute clarity. Derek stood there with the rock in his hands. He could have pushed her away. He could have taken everything and walked away. But there were 20 people around him, and they were all watching. And among them were the mothers of these children. And among them were men who remained silent in the presence of the village elder but would not have stayed silent if Derek had laid a hand on a child. Derek put the stone back. He turned around. He walked away. 4 people followed him. No one said a word. Kyle stood there watching them go. The system issued a notification. Reputation in the village, +30. Hearth rank, 2. The hut. The hearth's radius. The hut and the adjacent shed. Protection against fear spells is active within the radius. Kyle didn't know what fear spells were. He figured he'd find out later. Right now, something else was more important to him. 20 people saw him feeding the children. 20 people saw Derek try to take the food and fail. 20 people would go home and spread the word. By morning, the whole village would know that Kyle North, nicknamed Empty Stomach, was feeding other people's children smoked bacon in the dead of winter. And everyone in the village would ask themselves one question: where did he get the food? Kyle returned to the dugout. Astrid was sitting at the entrance. She had seen everything. She said he was an idiot. She said that giving away food when they had no reserves of their own was suicide. She said that Derek wouldn't stop now. Kyle said he knew. He said that was exactly what he was counting on. Astrid looked at him for a long time. She said she didn't understand him. Kyle said there was no need to for now. Inside, Maeve was sitting by the sourdough starter. She was feeding it barley porridge, in small portions, every 4 hours, just as Kyle had shown her. The sourdough starter was growing. It smelled of sourdough and mushrooms. Maeve sniffed it, and the wrinkles on her forehead smoothed out. Her coughing had become even less frequent. It hadn't stopped, but it was less frequent. Kyle made her bone broth every day, from hare bones. He simmered it for hours. Thick, rich, with wild garlic that Una had found under the snow on the southern slope. Day after day, Maeve drank the broth and coughed less and less. Her body was regaining its strength, slowly, gram by gram, degree by degree, but it was gaining strength. On the morning of the 8th day, Una brought in a hare, one she'd caught herself, her first. She'd shot it with a single arrow from 40 steps away, with frost-bitten fingers. She set it down by the threshold and looked at Kyle. He said it was a good shot. She turned away, but her shoulders relaxed for a second. Kyle saw it. He noticed things like that. A chef notices when a customer relaxes their shoulders after the first sip. It means the dish was a hit. On the 8th evening, Kyle sewed mittens from the hide of the hare Una had brought, small ones, for her hand. Fur on the inside, 2 separate fingers for the index and middle fingers, so she could shoot without taking off the mittens. He worked by the light of the stove. He sewed with a bone needle. His previous body didn't know how to sew. This Kyle did. His grandfather had taught him. His grandfather sewed nets and mended gloves and used to say that a man who couldn't sew didn't know how to live. Una sat across from him. She wasn't looking at the mittens, she was looking at his hands. He finished. He held them out to her. She took them, put them on, wiggled her fingers. The fingers fit perfectly. The fur gently wrapped around her frostbitten skin. The warmth spread immediately. Una looked at her hands in the mittens, then at Kyle, and for the first time in 6 years, she smiled. Not a wide smile, not an open one. The corners of her lips lifted by a millimeter, her eyes softened by a shade. But it was a smile, the first in 6 years. Maeve saw it, Ren saw it, Astrid saw it. All 3 froze, because they lived with Una and knew that Una didn't smile. Never. The system issued a notification. Una sew +5 heat, current value 17. Kyle put the needle away. He poured some thyme tea. He sat down by the stove. Maeve moved closer. Ren sat down on the other side. Una sat across from them in her new mittens, staring into the fire. Astrid sat in the corner. She didn't join them, but she watched the 4 of them by the fire, and her face wore an expression Kyle couldn't read, something between envy and fear. Envy because they were already together and she wasn't yet. Fear because she wanted to but didn't know how. On the 9th day, someone pounded on the door of the dugout. Kyle woke up instantly. Una was already standing there with a bow, an arrow knocked on the string.
Wren sat in the corner with a knife. Maeve pressed herself against the wall. Astrid stood behind the door, holding a log. A voice came from outside the door. A man's voice. Hoarse. He said he was looking for a runaway slave. He said he had a warrant from the southern magistrate. He said he knew she was here. Kyle opened the door. A man stood on the threshold. About 30 years old, skinny, wearing a leather cloak, a short sword at his belt, a bag slung over his shoulder. His eyes darted around. He looked past Kyle into the dugout, searching. Kyle blocked the doorway. He asked who he was looking for. The man said a slave with a rose brand on her left shoulder. He said she had escaped from the southern province 8 months ago. He said there was a reward for her capture. Kyle said there were no slaves here. The man smirked. He said the village head had already told him everything. He said that one of Kyle's 4 wives had the brand. He said he could go in and check, or Kyle could hand her over voluntarily. Behind Kyle there was silence. Wren didn't move. Kyle turned and looked at her. She was standing against the wall, a knife in her hand, a smile on her face. That very same smile. Dead. Empty. A smile that said she was used to it, that they'd taken her before, that they'd take her again, that that's just how the world works. She said quietly that he shouldn't risk himself for her sake. She said she was used to it. Kyle turned back to the man in the doorway. He said 3 things. First, by royal edict for the preservation of the Wren-Valens lineage, she is his lawful wife. The marriage record was certified by the village elder of Oak Hollow 9 days ago. Second, according to Article 6 of that same edict, the removal of a wife from her family is possible only by decision of the county court, not by order of the southern magistrate, who has no jurisdiction in the northern lands. Third, Kyle rolled up his left sleeve. On the inside of his forearm was a fresh tattoo. Rough, done last night with a charred stick and soot, the lines of a sprig of thyme. He said it was his family crest. He said his wife bore the same mark, on her shoulder, over any other mark. The man in the doorway looked at the tattoo, then at Kyle, then inside the dugout. He didn't see Wren. He saw 4 women, none of whom smiled at him. He saw a bow with a drawn string. He saw a log in Astrid's hands. He saw pots of sourdough starter and dried herbs and smoked fish hanging on a rope from the ceiling. He saw a home. Not a dugout, a home. He said he'd be back with the county sheriff. Kyle said he'd wait. The man left. Kyle closed the door. He turned around. Wren was standing in the same spot, a knife in her hand, a smile on her face. But her eyes were different. Her eyes were wet. She said he shouldn't have done that. She said he'd be in trouble now. She said she wasn't worth the trouble. Kyle walked over to her. He told her to let him see her shoulder. She froze. Then she slowly pulled the rag off her left shoulder. A brand. A rose. Red, bumpy skin, the size of a fist. Ugly and distinct. 12 years on her body. Wren didn't look. She turned her head away. She waited. For disgust. For pity. Or for that look she'd seen 1,000 times. The look that says she's an object with a price tag. Kyle picked up the charred stick, the very one he'd used to tattoo himself that night. He looked at the brand. He turned her shoulder toward the light and began to draw. Over the rose. Line by line. Slowly. Carefully. A sprig of thyme. Delicate leaves. A stem. He drew for 20 minutes. Wren stood motionless. She felt the stick's touch against the old scar. It didn't hurt, but she could feel it. Every line drawn over the brand was like a word written over a sentence. When he finished, there was a sprig of thyme on her shoulder. Rough. Black. On top of the red rose. The rose hadn't disappeared. It was visible beneath the new drawing, but it was no longer the focal point. It had become the background, the soil from which the garden grows. Kyle said that now it wasn't a rose. Now it was a garden. Wren stood there. The smile slipped from her face. For the first time in 12 years, Her face became bare, exposed. 19 years old. And she began to cry. Not the way one cries from grief, the way one cries because the grief has finally ended and you don't know what to do with it. She cried silently, without a sound. Tears ran down her cheeks and dripped onto the floor. Yuna stood by the wall, her bow lowered. She looked at Ren, she looked at Kyle, and at that moment she did something she hadn't done in 6 years. She opened her mouth and uttered a word. One. Mine. Quietly, hoarsely. Her voice rusty from 6 years of silence, but clearly. Mine. She said it while looking at Kyle, not as if he were her property, as if he belonged to her. Mine meant that he was part of her world, that he was inside the circle she had drawn around herself 6 years ago and let no one in. Mine meant she had let him in. Maeve dropped her mug. Astrid dropped her log. Ren stopped crying and turned to Yuna. All three stared at the hunter who had spoken her first word in 6 years. Yuna covered her mouth. She turned away. Her cheeks were red. She picked up her bow and went outside. The system sent a notification. Yuna So, plus 12 heat. Current value, 29. Ren Valenza, plus 15 heat. Current value, 31. Household circle unlocked. All wives skills are now pooled together. Available skills: Maeve Ashdown, Diagnostics, Starter Culture. Yuna So, Stealth, Butchering, Tracking. Ren Walensa, Pain Tolerance, Southern Languages. Astrid Marsh, Literacy. No skills are unlocked at the current warmth level. Kyle looked at the last line. Astrid, Warmth 5, no skills. He turned toward her. She was standing in the corner, a log at her feet, her hands at her sides. She was looking at Kyle and her face showed nothing. No anger, no warmth, no contempt. Emptiness. The emptiness of a person who wants to enter a room but can't remember how to open the door. Kyle didn't approach her. He didn't say anything. He went back to the stove. He started cooking dinner. You can't rush Astrid. Astrid isn't Ren, who's grateful for every little thing. Astrid isn't Yuna, who understands without words. Astrid isn't Maeve, who opens up through curiosity. Astrid is a wall, and you can't break through a wall. You can only walk through it. But for that, you need a door. And she'll open the door herself. Or she won't. After lunch, Kyle went outside. He needed to think. The inspector would be back, maybe with a bailiff, maybe without. But he'll be back, and next time, words alone won't be enough. He needs a document, a real one, a marriage certificate certified by the village head. The problem was that the village head had only certified the marriage verbally. There was nothing on paper. Because the village head had no intention of making this marriage real. He'd dumped 4 women on Kyle just to get rid of them, not to give them a family. Kyle needed a document, with a seal, signed by the village headman. He won't get it by asking. The village headman will refuse. He needs leverage. Kyle stood in the cold and thought. Then he went back inside. Astrid was sitting in the corner, writing on birch bark. He approached her. He asked if she knew the royal edict on the preservation of lineages. She looked up. A gleam appeared in her eyes, cold and sharp. She said she knew it by heart, all 14 articles. She was the count's daughter. She'd been taught the law since she was 10. Kyle asked if there was an article in the edict that required the village head to issue a written marriage certificate. Astrid didn't answer right away. She thought. She ran through the articles in her head. Then she said that Article 9 required the village elder to provide written confirmation of the marriage within 3 days of the announcement. Failure to comply was punishable by a fine equal to 1 year's smoke tax. Kyle asked how many days had passed since the announcement. Astrid looked at her birch bark notes. 9. Kyle smiled. Astrid saw that smile. She understood. The village head had broken the law. Not Kyle, the village head.
9 days without a written record. A fine equal to 1 year's tax. That wasn't leverage. It was a sledgehammer. Astrid stood up. For the first time in 9 days, she stood up differently. Not like a woman who'd been thrown into a pit. Like an aristocrat who had spotted a weak spot in the enemy's defenses. She said she would go with him. Kyle said there was no need. He said he could handle it. She looked at him the way one looks at a person who fails to grasp the obvious. She said he was a peasant. She said the village headman wouldn't listen to a peasant who quoted the law. She said the village headman would listen to Count Marsh's daughter quoting the law because Count Marsh's daughter knows the law, whereas the peasant had just picked it up somewhere. Kyle thought for a second. She was right. He nodded. They set off together toward the village headman's house. Along the way, Astrid walked with her back straight and her head held high. She walked just as she had 8 years ago, before her father was hanged, before the world told her she was nothing. She walked like the Count's daughter. The village headman was sitting by the stove. Derek stood behind him. Seated nearby was that same man in the leather cloak, the inspector. He had already been here. He had already told the village headman. The village headman looked at Kyle. Then at Astrid. He said that Kyle was harboring a runaway slave. He said it was a violation of the law. He said the slave must be handed over. Astrid spoke up. Her voice was steady, emotionless. She said that according to Article 2 of the Edict on the Preservation of Lineages, a woman who has entered into marriage within the northern lands receives the status of a free wife regardless of her previous status. She said that according to Article 4, any external order to remove a wife from her family requires confirmation from the county court, not the southern magistrate. She said that according to Article 9, the village head is required to provide written confirmation of the marriage within 3 days. 9 days have passed. A fine. A year's worth of house tax. She said that, according to Article 11, preventing a family from exercising its rights under the edict is punishable by removal from office and confiscation of property in favor of the affected family. She spoke for 3 minutes. Without pause, without hesitation. 14 articles, 7 violations. Each with a penalty, each with an exact citation. The village head sat and listened. His face grew stony with every sentence. Derek opened his mouth and closed it again. The inspector in the leather cloak looked at Astrid and turned pale, realizing that the girl in rags knew the law better than he knew the way home. When Astrid finished, the room was silent. The village head remained silent for 10 seconds. Then he stood up. He walked over to the chest. He took out a parchment, a quill, ink. He wrote for 5 minutes. A marriage record. All 4 names. The seal of the village of Oak Hollow. The village headman's signature. The date was 9 days ago. Backdated. He handed the parchment to Kyle. The village elder's hand didn't tremble. His eyes didn't flicker. But Kyle could see that something inside the village elder had shifted. It hadn't broken. It had shifted. The village elder looked at Astrid. He said she looked like her father. Astrid didn't reply. She took the parchment from Kyle's hands. She rolled it up. She tucked it into her bosom. They went outside. On the street, Astrid walked in silence. Her back was straight, but her hands were trembling. Kyle saw it. He didn't say anything. They reached the dugout. They went inside. Astrid sat down in a corner. She placed the parchment on her lap. She looked at it. Then at Kyle. She said he wasn't like the others. She said she didn't know yet if that was good or bad. Kyle said he didn't know either. She smirked. For the first time. Not a smile, a smirk. A hint of irony at the corner of her mouth. But for Astrid Marsh, it was like Una speaking a word. A breakthrough through a wall that had stood for 8 years. The system issued a notification. Astrid Marsh plus 8 heat. Current value 13. On the 10th day, Kyle woke up with a plan. He had 31 days left until the tax was due. A sack of grain, 4 hides, an iron ingot. He almost had the hides.
9 hare hides were drying on a rope behind the dugout. 3 more days and he'd have 12. 4 for the tax, 8 for trade. He could gather enough grain if he kept catching hares and trading them with the village elder. But the iron ingot. Iron was more valuable than silver in the village. Iron meant axes and knives and arrowheads and door hinges. No one would trade a bar for hares. No one would trade a bar for anything because there was almost no iron in Oak Hollow. Kyle had been thinking about this all morning while he cooked his porridge. The day's draw. Total heat 78. Result? Turnip seeds, 50 of them. A small bag, light. Kyle weighed it in the palm of his hand. Turnips. Not the most interesting vegetable, but the hardiest. Turnips grow in the cold. Turnips ripen in 40 days. 40 days. He has 31 left before the tax is due. He won't make it in time. But if he plants them today, in 40 days there will be food. Real food. Fresh. Alive. Not dried or smoked. For that, he'll need a greenhouse. Kyle stepped outside. -18. The sky was gray. The wind was light. He walked around the dugout. Beyond it was a slope, a south-facing one. There was less snow there. Even through the gray haze, the sun cast more light on the south-facing slope. He began to dig, with his hands, with a rock, the same one he'd used to break the ice on the river. The ground was frozen, hard as concrete. The first 10 centimeters took 2 hours. Then it got easier. Beneath the frozen layer, the soil was softer, damp, dark, alive. Kyle dug a trench, 1 meter wide, 3 meters long, half a meter deep. He dug all day. By evening, his hands were covered in blood. His fingernails were torn off. His back wouldn't straighten. But the trench was ready. Una arrived at noon. She looked at what he was doing. She didn't say a word. She set her bow down beside him and began digging alongside him. She didn't ask why. She could see he was digging with a purpose. That was enough. Wren arrived an hour after Una. She brought hot broth in a mug. She set it down next to Kyle. He drank without stopping. She picked up a stick and began loosening the soil at the bottom of the trench. Maeve came out in the evening. Her cough had become very infrequent. She looked at the trench and asked what he was planning to plant. Kyle showed her the turnip seeds. Maeve picked up a single seed. She rolled it between her fingers. She sniffed it. She said she'd never seen seeds like these before. She said they smelled strange, fresh, as if summer were sleeping inside them. Kyle said they were turnip seeds. Maeve said she knew what a turnip was, but these seeds were different. She was right. The seeds from the system were different, earth-grown, bred over centuries of selection, faster, larger, hardier. Kyle explained the plan. A trench in the ground, half a meter deep, the earth's warmth from below, a covering of parchment held together with fish glue on top. The parchment lets light through. It traps the heat. Inside the trench, the temperature would stay above 0 even if it were -20 outside. Not much higher. +2, maybe +5, but it'll be enough. Maeve listened. Her eyes sparkled, not from the heat, but from curiosity. She said she had some moss, sphagnum. She'd been collecting it for poultices. But sphagnum holds 20 times its own weight in moisture. If you put it at the bottom of the trench, it'll act like a sponge. The soil won't dry out. Kyle looked at her. She was thinking like a farmer. No, she was thinking like a scientist. Like someone who understands plants not from the outside, but from the inside. He said it was a great idea. She looked away. She coughed. Not because she was sick, out of embarrassment. The next day, Kyle made a cover. He traded the parchment to the blacksmith's wife for some smoked fish. He made the fish glue himself from the heads and tails. The glue turned out smelly but strong. He stretched the parchment over a frame made of willow twigs. The frame rested on the edges of the trench. Inside, it became quiet and warm. Kyle placed Maeve's sphagnum moss on the bottom. He covered it with soil. He poured warm water from the kettle over it. He planted the seeds, 50 of them, in rows, at equal intervals. He covered them with parchment. He stood up. He looked at his work. A dirty hole in the snow covered with a murky film. By the standards of his past life, it was pitiful. By the standards of this world, it was impossible. No one in Heimskott planted anything in winter. In winter, the earth is dead. Everyone knew that. Kyle knew otherwise. The earth is never dead. The earth can be cold. Those are two different things. On the 12th day, Kyle solved the iron problem. The solution came from Una. She returned from hunting and brought back not a hair, but information. Using gestures and drawings in the snow, she showed that 3 hours' walk to the north lay an abandoned smithy, the village of Greystone. It was abandoned 2 years ago. The residents either went south or died. The blacksmith shop stands empty. There might be iron inside. Kyle looked at Una's drawing, a 3-hour journey through the snow at -20. 6 hours there and back. No skis, no sled, no horse. He'll go. He told Una he'd leave tomorrow at dawn. She shook her head. She pointed at herself, then at him. Then she held up 2 fingers, together. She'd go with him. Kyle wanted to refuse. Una was needed here for hunting, for protection. But he looked at her and realized he couldn't say no. Not because she'd be offended, but because she was right. He didn't know the way. He doesn't know how to read tracks in the snow. He won't see a wolf's trail or hear the ice cracking in the marsh. Una will see and hear them. They set out on the 13th day before dawn. 24 below, the coldest day since Kyle's arrival. Una walked ahead, wearing new mittens, a bow on her back, 3 arrows. Kyle followed behind her. On his feet, wraps of hair pelts over old rags. Makeshift boots, not pretty, but warm. They walked in silence. Una didn't speak. Kyle didn't force a conversation. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was productive, like the silence in a kitchen when 2 cooks work side by side and know what each is doing without words. 2 hours later, they reached Greystone. The village was dead. 6 houses, all with collapsed roofs. Snow up to the windows. The doors were open. Inside, they were empty. Famine had taken the people. Looters had taken their belongings. The blacksmith shop stood on the edge of the village. Stone. Sturdy. The roof was intact. Kyle went inside. It was cold. Dark. It smelled of old iron and coal. The forge was out. The anvil was still there. Heavy. No one had been able to carry it away. Tools. Some had been taken, but not all of them. Kyle found a pair of tongs, a hammer with a cracked handle, 3 nails, and under the rubble in the corner, he dug through the debris. Stones, coal dust, scraps of leather. Beneath them lay an ingot. Iron, rough, covered in scale, about 2 kilograms. Kyle picked it up. Heavy, cold, rough. It was the tax. The entire tax. It would take him 20 days to gather a sack of grain. They had hides. Now they had iron, too. He looked at Una. She was standing by the door, looking outside, keeping watch. He told her what he'd found. She turned around. She looked at the ingot. She nodded. Her face was calm. She wasn't surprised. She knew he'd find it, because she knew the forge was here and that there was iron left in it. She'd brought him here on purpose. She knew, and she'd brought him. Kyle realized this and looked at her differently. Una isn't just a silent hunter. Una is a strategist. Una thinks 3 steps ahead and does so without saying a single word. On the way back, Kyle carried the ingot tucked under his arm. It was heavy. The cold iron drew the warmth from his body. An hour later, he began to shiver. Una noticed. She stopped. She took off her outer pelt. She wrapped the ingot in it. Then she put the pelt back on. Now the iron lay between the layers of the pelt rather than against his bare skin. Kyle looked at her. She turned away. Her ears were red, not from the cold. They returned by evening. It was warm in the dugout. Maeve sat by the stove, feeding the sourdough starter. Wren was cooking porridge. Astrid was counting the hides. Kyle placed the ingot on the floor. All 4 of them looked at it. Astrid was the first to understand. She walked over, picked up the ingot, weighed it in her hand.
looked at Kyle, said it was a tax. Kyle said yes. Astrid said there were still 28 days until the deadline. Kyle said yes. Astrid said he was going to pay the tax early. Kyle said no, he was going to pay the tax on time, but with a surplus. Such a surplus that the tax collector would report it to the higher-ups. Astrid looked at him. Her eyes had that look Kyle had seen on restaurant critics' faces when they tasted a dish they hadn't expected. A mixture of respect and irritation at having to respect it. She said it was dangerous. She said the excess would attract attention. Kyle said that was exactly what he wanted. Astrid opened her mouth, closed it, thought for a moment. Then she said he was either a genius or a suicide. Kyle said that in his previous profession it was one and the same. She didn't get the joke, but she smiled, for the second time. Day 14. Kyle was kneeling in front of the greenhouse, peering through the parchment. Inside it was +4. He could tell by the condensation on the walls. At +4, the condensation is fine and even. At 0, it freezes into frost. The condensation wasn't freezing. Amid the dark soil, green dots. Cotyledons. The first leaves. Tiny, pale, but green. Alive. A splash of green in a white world. Kyle looked at them and felt what he always felt whenever the starter rose or the sauce thickened just right. The quiet satisfaction of a craftsman who knows the process is working. He stood up. He dusted off his knees, turned around. 6 people were standing behind him. 3 children. That same red-headed girl and 2 boys. 2 women, his neighbor's wife who had come for bread, and another woman, an old woman, hunchbacked, with a cane. They were all looking at the greenhouse, at the green specks through the parchment. The red-headed girl stepped closer. She pressed her nose against the parchment. She exhaled. The parchment fogged up. She wiped it with her sleeve. She looked at the sprouts. Then she turned to Kyle. She asked what it was. He said it was a turnip. She asked what a turnip was. Kyle froze. Then he realized. She was 8 years old. The long cold began when she was 1. She had never seen a growing vegetable. She didn't know what greens were. To her, grass was a word from the fairy tales the old people told. He crouched down in front of her. He said that a turnip was food that grew out of the ground. She asked how food could grow. He said it was a long story. She said she had time. An old woman with a cane approached the greenhouse. She bent down. She looked at it for a long time. Then she straightened up. She looked at Kyle. Her eyes were cloudy with cataracts, but sharp. She said the last time she'd seen greenery was 7 years ago. She said she thought she'd never see it again. Kyle didn't say anything. He didn't know what to say. He stood before the elderly and the children who were looking at the 24 turnip sprouts as if they were a miracle. And he realized that in this world, that was indeed a miracle. By the evening of the 14th day, 20 people had visited the greenhouse. Each left quieter than when they'd arrived. The news spread through the village like heat from a stove, slowly but unstoppably. Kyle, empty stomach, was growing food. In winter. From the ground. The 15th day brought a problem. Derek. He didn't come with the guys. He came alone. In the morning. While Kyle was at the river by the hole. Derek approached the greenhouse. He lifted the edge of the parchment. Peered inside. Una saw him from the dugout. She came out with a bow. An arrow knocked on the string. Derek looked at her. He looked at the greenhouse. He lowered the parchment. He said the village elder wanted to see Kyle. Today, Una didn't lower her bow until he was gone. When Kyle returned with the fish, Una showed him Derek's tracks by the greenhouse. Kyle inspected the shelter. The parchment was undamaged. The seedlings were intact. Derek hadn't broken anything. That was worse than if he had broken something, because it meant that Derek hadn't come to break things, but to look. And if Derek is looking, it means he's thinking. And if Derek is thinking, it means he's planning. Kyle went to see the village elder, alone. Astrid wanted to go with him, but Kyle said it wasn't necessary this time. He needed Astrid as a weapon for the final blow. No need to drag her into every little thing. The village elder was sitting by the stove, alone, without Derek. He offered Kyle a seat. Kyle sat down. The village elder asked what was growing in the pit behind the dugout. Kyle said turnips. The village elder asked how. Kyle explained. A trench, the warmth of the earth, shelter, simple science, no magic. The village elder listened. Then he fell silent for a long time. He stared into the fire and thought. Kyle waited. Finally, the village elder spoke. He said that Oak Hollow was dying. He said that over the past 8 years, the population had shrunk from 300 to 80. He said that 12 people had died last winter. More would die this winter. He said he was doing everything he could, culling the weak so the strong might survive, sending women off in government convoys so there would be fewer mouths to feed. He's slaughtering the last of the livestock to pay the tax. He said he hates himself for it every day, but he sees no other way. Then he looked at Kyle. He said that if Kyle had another way, he should show it, not tell him, show him. Kyle looked at the chief, Magnus Oak, 54 years old, a beard frosted over. His hands were large, calloused. His eyes were tired, not angry, just tired. For the first time, Kyle saw him not as an enemy, but as a man who was drowning and dragging others down, not out of malice, but because he didn't know how to swim. Kyle said he'd show him, but he needed something. Access to the communal storeroom. Not a key, not authority, just access. The chance to see what was there and what wasn't. The village elder asked why. Kyle said he wanted to count. How much food was in the village? How many mouths to feed? How many days? He said that until he'd counted, he wouldn't be able to show the way. The village elder thought for a minute. Then he stood up. He pulled a key from his belt. Bronze. Heavy. He placed it on the table. He said that in the morning, Kyle could go into the storeroom, look around, count. But he had to return the key by noon. Kyle nodded. He took the key. He turned around at the threshold. The village elder was sitting by the fire, hunched over, an old man. He looked 70, not 54. Kyle thought that hunger aged a person faster than time. On the morning of the 16th day, Kyle opened the communal storeroom, a barn behind the village headman's house, the smell of mold and mice. He went in with Astrid. Astrid counted. Kyle watched. Sacks of barley. 7. 5 kilograms each. 35 kilograms. For 80 people. That's 10 days. Maybe 12 if they stretch it out. Dried meat. 2 blocks. 3 kilograms each. 6 kilograms. For 80 people, that's 2 days. Salt. Half a sack. 1 kilogram. That'll last a month if we're careful. Iron. Nothing. Empty. It all went toward the last tax. Hides. 4. Moose hides. Thin. Worn. Nothing else. No oil, no fat, no dried berries, no roots. Empty. Astrid was writing it down on birch bark. The numbers fell into place neatly. Columns. Rows. She could calculate in her head faster than Kyle could have imagined. 15 minutes later, she looked up. She said that at the current rate of consumption, the village would last 18 days. Not 31 until the tax. 18. After that, the children would start dying. Then the elderly. Then everyone else. Kyle stood in the empty pantry and stared at the numbers. 18 days. He didn't just have to survive himself, he had to feed the village. 80 mouths to feed, at -20. No grain, no livestock, no magic. With just one greenhouse growing turnips and one starter culture in a clay pot. He closed his eyes. Thought. Opened them. Told Astrid he needed her skill. Literacy. He would dictate, she would write it down. The plan. Item 1. Fish. The river was frozen, but the fish were under the ice. If they drilled 10 holes instead of 1 and set a fishing rod made of a stick and string at each one, they could pull up to 15 fish a day. Una knows where the fish gather in winter. 5 people are needed on the ice every day. Item 2. Snares. Not 4, 20. Set them up throughout the forest. We'll need rope. We can twist it from bark fiber. We'll need 3 people to twist and set them up. Item 3. Pine bark. Edible. High in calories. It can be ground into flour. Pine flour plus barley flour plus sourdough equals bread. Coarse but filling. We need 2 people to harvest the bark. Item 4. Smoking. Build a second smokehouse. A large one. A communal one. Smoke fish and meat for storage. Smoked food keeps for months. 4 people are needed for construction. Item 5. Greenhouses. 3 more trenches. There's enough space on the southern slope. He has 50 turnip seeds. 20 have already been planted. 30 remain. Plus, we can try the wild roots that Maeve knows about. We'll need 6 people to dig them up. Astrid was taking notes. Quickly, without mistakes. She didn't interrupt. She listened and wrote. When Kyle finished, she read the list back. She looked at him. She said that this would require people. Not 5, 20. She said that 20 people out of 80 is a quarter of the village. She said that none of them would work for Kyle for free. Kyle said it didn't have to be for free. He said that everyone who works gets food. Fish from the communal catch, bread from the communal oven, a place by the communal fire. Astrid said it was a commune. Kyle didn't know the word in the language of this world. He said it was a kitchen. In the kitchen, everyone does their own thing, and everyone eats. Astrid smiled, for the 3rd time. Kyle returned the key to the village elder before noon, along with the plan drawn on birch bark. The village elder read for a long time. He moved his lips, then he looked up. He asked where Kyle knew all this from. Kyle said his grandfather had been a fisherman. It was true. The 17th day, 23 people went to work. Not because the village elder ordered them to, because the village elder showed them the plan and said it wasn't his. It was the plan of a boy nicknamed Empty Stomach. And if anyone wanted to eat in the spring, they should go to the boy and listen. The women were the first to arrive. The blacksmith's wife, the hunter's widow, the mother of the red-haired girl. 3 sisters from the house on the edge of the village. They came because they'd tasted Kyle's bread, because they'd seen the greens in his trench, because their children had eaten his smoked lard. Then the men came, the old fishermen. 2 guys who used to follow Derek but realized you'd never get a full meal with Derek. A one-armed carpenter. He'd lost his other arm in a logging accident 3 years ago. With one hand, he worked better than most with 2. Kyle divided them up, 5 on the ice. Una led the way. She knew where the fish were in the deep pools at the bend in the river. She pointed, and the fishermen drilled holes. By evening on the first day, they'd pulled 22 fish from 10 holes. 22. That's not much for 80 people. But yesterday there were 3. Tomorrow there'll be 30. The day after tomorrow, 40. 3 of them went to weave ropes from bast fiber. Maeve taught them. She knew how to soak the bast so the fiber would become pliable. Her hands were dexterous, slender. As a herbalist, she was used to weaving and knitting. In one day, they twisted enough rope for 15 snares. Kyle set them up himself. He demonstrated the technique. He showed the angle of the loop. He showed how to secure the anchor. The next morning, there were 4 hairs in the snares. 6 men were digging trenches. 3 new greenhouses. Next to the first one on the south-facing slope, the ground was frozen, the work was hard, but 6 men dug faster than Kyle could on his own. By the evening of the second day, 3 trenches were ready. Kyle covered them with moss and soil. He planted the remaining 30 turnip seeds and the wild roots that Maeve found in her bag. Wild garlic bulbs, sorrel roots, turnip seeds. Maeve said she didn't know if they would grow. Kyle said they would. She asked how he knew. He said the earth wants to grow, it just needs a little help. 4 of them built a smokehouse, a big one, out of stones, in the village square.
Kyle was in charge. He showed them how to lay the stones so the draft would flow properly. He showed them where to leave openings for the smoke. He showed them how to make grates out of willow twigs. The one-armed carpenter turned out to be the best stonemason. He laid the stones evenly and precisely, with one hand. He held the other in place with his chin. The smokehouse took shape in 2 days. A stone box, 1 meter by 1.5 meters, with a lid made of flat stones, with a grate inside on 3 levels. They loaded the first batch on the 20th day. 30 fish fillets, 10 pieces of rabbit meat. Smoke from alder, steady, cool. The scent spread through the village. But now it wasn't just the smell from a solitary dugout. It was the smell coming from the village square, a shared smell. The smell of a village doing something together. Astrid sat in the dugout and kept track of everything. She had set up a system. Everyone who works receives a share of the total catch proportional to their workday. A fisherman who stands on the ice for 6 hours gets 2 fish and a portion of bread. A woman who knits ropes for 4 hours receives 1 fish and half a portion. A child who carries firewood receives half a fish. She wrote down every name, every hour, every fish. Kyle watched her work and understood why the Count's daughter was worth 4 soldiers. Astrid didn't know how to hunt. She didn't know how to fish. She didn't know how to sew, and she didn't know how to heal. But she knew how to count. She knew how to keep records. She knew how to create order out of chaos. And in a starving village where every fish counted, that was more important than a bow and arrows. On the 21st day, Wren did something Kyle hadn't expected. She came to him in the morning, without a smile, her real face, serious. She said she wanted to help in the kitchen. Kyle said she was already helping. She said she wanted to really help. Not sweep, not carry water. Cook. Kyle looked at her. She stood before him, small, dark-skinned, 19 years old, 12 of those as a servant. Her hands were used to rags and brooms, but her eyes told a different story. Her eyes said she wanted to create, not clean up. Kyle said he'd teach her. He started with a knife, how to hold it, how to cut, how to clean fish. Wren picked it up quickly. Her hands were small but precise. She was used to detailed work. 3 days later, she was cleaning fish just as well as Una. 5 days later, she was making broth that Kyle couldn't tell apart from his own. She memorized everything, every pinch, every gesture, every timing. How many minutes to boil it, when to add salt, when to take it off the heat. She didn't just memorize, she understood. Kyle could tell by the way she tasted it. She didn't just swallow it, she tasted it. She rolled it around on her tongue. She thought. Then she added something of her own, a pinch of wild onion, a drop of fish oil, a crushed rosehip. She didn't know the word taste, she knew the sensation. The 23rd day, evening, Kyle sat by the stove and counted. Hides, 15 hare hides, 3 fox hides that Una had brought, 1 wolf hide that the old fisherman had dragged in. 19 in total, 4 for taxes, 15 for trade or sale. Grain, 4 sacks of barley. He traded 3 for fish with the village headman. Wren earned 1 by selling smoked fish to the blacksmith's wife in exchange for barley from her personal stash. There's a sack of grain for the tax. Iron, a bar from Greystone. Check. The tax has been collected, 18 days ahead of schedule. Kyle looked at Astrid. She was thinking the same thing. She raised her head. Their eyes met. She nodded, briefly, dryly. But that nod contained everything she couldn't put into words. Respect, recognition, a hint of trust. The system issued a notification. Astrid Marsh +4 heat, current value 17. Kyle looked at the overall metrics. Maeve 24, Una 29, Wren 38, Astrid 17. Total heat 108. The daily draws had become more interesting. Garlic, peppercorns, bay leaf. The system was giving him spices. A world where all food was bland and gray was gaining color and scent, 1 pinch a day. Kyle leaned back against the straw. He closed his eyes.
23 days ago, he had been standing in a square in a stranger's body with 4 women who hated him. Now he had a home. He had food. He had a team. He had a village that was beginning to believe that spring was possible. And there was a timer. 18 days until the tax. He would pay it, with interest. And then the real game would begin, the 24th day. The village head had called a meeting. Kyle found out about it that morning from the red-headed girl. She'd run up to the dugout, barefoot through the snow. She said everyone was heading to the square. She said the village head was angry. Kyle got dressed and went outside. Una was already waiting at the door, a bow on her back. Maeve stood beside her. Her cough was almost gone. 10 days of bone broth, thyme, and warmth had done the trick. She was still thin and pale, but her eyes had come alive. Wren walked slightly behind them, without a smile, with a serious expression. That was how she walked now. Astrid brought up the rear, as always, back straight, chin up, under her jacket, birch bark with numbers. She knew they would be talking about Kyle at the town meeting. She was preparing herself. About 60 people were standing in the square, almost the entire village. The village elder stood on the porch of his house. Derek was beside him. Derek's face was both angry and smug. He was hatching a plan and was pleased about it. The village elder raised his hand. The crowd fell silent. He began to speak. He said that Kyle North had violated 3 village statutes. First, he had built a smokehouse on communal land without permission from the Council of Elders. Second, he had organized labor cooperatives without consulting the village head. Third, he had used the communal storeroom for his own inventory. A fine was imposed for each of the 3 violations. The total fines amounted to 2 sacks of barley and 1 hide, or confiscation of property. The crowd began to murmur, not maliciously, but anxiously. The people who had worked with Kyle over the past week exchanged glances. They had eaten his fish. They had warmed themselves by his smokehouse. They had seen the greens in his greenhouses, and now the village head was going to punish him for feeding them. Kyle stood in the crowd and looked at the village head. He wasn't surprised. He'd been expecting this. If not today, then tomorrow. The village head hadn't given him the key to the storeroom out of kindness. He'd given it to him so he could later accuse him of overstepping his authority. Derek had put the idea in his head. Kyle could see it in their eyes. They were working together. The village head gave, and Derek found a reason to take it away. Kyle took a step forward. He wanted to speak, but Astrid placed her hand on his shoulder. He turned. She shook her head. "No, not you." Astrid stepped out of the crowd. She stood before the village head, an aristocrat in rags before the village head. She began to speak. Her voice was steady, cold, clear, like a blade on ice. She said that the Oak Hollow Village Charter had been adopted 23 years ago under Paragraph 6 of the County Code on Self-Government. She said that Paragraph 6 was valid only on the condition that the village was listed in the Registry of Active Settlements. She said that, by decree of the Royal Chancellery from the 3rd year of the Long Frost, all villages with a population of fewer than 100 people had been automatically reclassified as survival settlements. Oak Hollow, with a population of 80, is a survival settlement. In survival settlements, it is not the village charter that applies, but the emergency code. Under the emergency code, any resident has the right to build facilities for storing and processing food without approval. Any resident has the right to organize work groups to procure food without approval. Any resident has the right to keep records of food supplies, provided the results of those records are accessible to all residents. Astrid paused. She looked at the village head. She continued. She said that, according to Article 3 of the Emergency Code, the head of a survival settlement is obligated to assist with any actions aimed at saving lives. Obstructing such actions is punishable by removal from office by decision of the General Assembly. She said that, according to Article 7 of the Emergency Code, imposing fines on residents of a surviving settlement for actions related to the procurement and storage of food is prohibited. Violation is punishable by the transfer of the village head's position to a person appointed by the General Assembly. She fell silent. The crowd was silent. The village head was silent. Derek was silent. The silence lasted 10 seconds.
Then the village head asked how the daughter of the executed traitor knew the emergency code. Astrid replied that her father, Count Marsh, had been a member of the Royal Council for the Northern Territories and that she had learned the code at the age of 12 years old. The village elder looked at her for a long time. Then he turned to the crowd. He asked if any of the villagers wished to corroborate the charges against Kyle North. Silence. No one raised a hand. The red-haired girl's mother stood in the front row. She looked at the town elder and said nothing. The blacksmith's wife stood beside her. She said nothing. An old fisherman stood behind them. He said nothing. The 23 people who had worked with Kyle stood in silence, and their silence was louder than any shout. The village elder lowered his hand. He said the charges had been dropped. He turned and went inside. Derek stood alone on the porch. He looked at Astrid, at Kyle, at the crowd that was beginning to disperse. His face was white, not from the cold, but because he had seen his world crumble and could do nothing about it. He was the last to leave. The crowd dispersed slowly. People approached Kyle. They didn't say anything in particular. They nodded. They patted him on the shoulder. The red-haired girl's mother lingered. She said her daughter's name was Ellie. She said that now, every morning, Ellie runs to the greenhouse to watch the turnip grow. She said thank you. Then she left. Kyle stood in the square. 4 women were beside him. Maeve on his left, Una slightly behind him, Wren was on his right. Astrid was in front of him. She was tucking birch bark into her bosom. Her hands were trembling. He told her she'd been magnificent. She looked at him. Her eyes were wet. She told him not to get used to it. She said she wasn't going to save him every time. Kyle said it wouldn't be necessary every time. Once was enough for the village to remember. They returned to the dugout. The system sent a notification. Astrid Marsh plus 20 warmth. Current value 37. Skill unlocked. Law. Astrid Marsh can analyze laws and find legal loopholes. Analysis accuracy 90%. Hearth rank 3. Courtyard. Hearth radius. The hut and the area within a 50-meter radius. Fear spells do not work within this radius. Poisonings are not fatal. Kyle looked at the last line. Poisonings are not fatal. He didn't know why he needed this. Not yet, anyway. That evening, Kyle learned something. The village headman had written the letter that very night. Not to the county seat, further away. Wren found out from the blacksmith's wife, who had seen Derek send a horseman south. Wren came to Kyle. She said the letter had been sent. She said she didn't know to whom, but she knew the direction. South, toward the capital. Kyle looked at Astrid. Astrid turned pale. She said one word. The order. Kyle didn't know what the order was. Astrid explained. The Order of Ash, a sect under the king. Officially, guardians of the purity of the faith. Unofficially, they control the supply of salt and grain throughout the kingdom. They keep an eye on anyone who disrupts order, anyone who feeds others without permission, anyone who creates warmth where there should be cold. Astrid said her father had tried to stop the order, and the order burned him. She said this calmly, without tears, without a tremor in her voice, as calmly as someone who had lived with that knowledge for 8 years and learned to bear it like a scar. Kyle listened. Then he said the letter was already on its way. That meant they had time until it arrived, until it was read, until someone decided to come. 2 weeks, maybe 3. In that time, he had to become so indispensable to the village that no inspector could touch him without facing consequences. Astrid looked at him. She said he didn't understand. She said the order didn't need consequences. The order itself was the consequence. Kyle said he understood, but he had no choice. He was a cook. A cook doesn't run out of the kitchen when an inspection comes. A cook gets things in order and cooks the best meal of his life. Astrid was silent. Then she said quietly that he was the first person in 8 years who hadn't turned pale at the mention of the order. Kyle said he did turn pale at the mention of the health department. It's pretty much the same thing.
She didn't get it, but she smiled. For the fourth time. Day 27. Kyle stood in front of the greenhouse and counted the sprouts. 47 out of 50 seeds had sprouted. The turnip looked healthy. The leaves were sturdy, dark green. The roots stretched into the moss and soil. The first harvest would be in 13 days. Nearby, in 3 trenches, wild garlic, sorrel, and wild mustard were sprouting. Maeve came to the greenhouses every morning. She checked the moisture level. She sniffed the soil. She touched the leaves. She talked to the plants, quietly, when she thought no one could hear her. Kyle could hear her. He didn't interrupt. At the restaurant, he also talked to the sourdough starter. Barbara loved it when people talked to her. At least that's what Kyle thought. On the 28th day, Maeve came to Kyle with a pot. Inside was a mass, dark, thick, with a pungent smell. She said she'd mixed the sourdough starter with fish broth and left it by the stove for 3 days. The mixture had fermented. The smell was sharp, salty, and deep. Kyle sniffed it. Then he tasted it with the tip of his finger. Umami. Pure umami. A flavor that has no name in this world a name for. Fish sauce. Maeve had made fish sauce. Not the kind in bottles at the Asian grocery store. Rough, cloudy, but real. Fermented protein, glutamate. A flavor that turns bland porridge into food that makes you want to live. Kyle looked at Maeve. She stood there, waiting for his reaction. His cough had almost stopped. His cheeks had turned pink. In 28 days, she'd gone from dying to alive. Not healthy, not yet, but alive. He told her it was wonderful. He said she'd just invented something that had taken 3,000 years to develop in his world. She didn't understand, but she smiled. Her first real smile. Not bitter, not ironic. Alive. The system issued a notification. Maeve Ashdown, +6 heat. Current value, 30. Kyle added her sauce to the evening porridge. He dripped 3 drops into each bowl. The reaction was the same for all 4 of them. A pause. Wide eyes. The second spoonful went down faster than the first. Wren said the porridge tasted different. Una didn't say anything but gestured for seconds. Astrid ate in silence. Then she looked at her empty bowl, then at Kyle. She said he was a dangerous man. Kyle asked why. She said that a man who knows how to make food taste good knows how to make people dependent. Kyle said it wasn't dependence, it was taste. She said she didn't see the difference, but there was no venom in her voice. There was something new, something warm. The 29th day. Kyle began preparing for the tax, not just to pay it, but to pay it correctly. He gathered everything on the floor of the dugout, a sack of barley, full, even heaped high. The grain was clean. Astrid sorted through it by hand. She removed the stones, husks, and mouse droppings. Every single grain was in place. 4 hides, not hare hides, better. Una had hunted a fox. Wren tanned the pelt so that the fur became soft and shiny. She knew how to tan leather. 12 years in slavery had taught her a lot. 4 fox pelts, the kind of quality usually found only in county shops. An iron ingot. Kyle scraped the scale off it, polished it with a stone. The ingot gleamed. But that was just the tax, the bare minimum, the mandatory amount. Kyle added a little extra on top. 10 strips of smoked fish, tied together with bast rope, golden in color, smelling of alder smoke. A pot of Maeve's fish sauce, covered with an oiled cloth. 3 sprigs of fresh greens from the greenhouse. The turnip wasn't ripe yet, but the leaves were large enough to be cut off. Green leaves in winter. For the tax collector who would arrive from the county where it too is frosty, with gray skies, and not a single green leaf in 8 years, this will come as a shock. Astrid looked at the spread before her. She said this wasn't a tax, it was a message. Kyle nodded. Exactly. A message saying that in the village of Oak Hollow, there is a man who knows how to feed people, who knows how to grow greens in winter, who knows how to do things no one has ever heard of. The collector will report it to the higher-ups. The higher-ups will take an interest, an auditor will arrive. And then Kyle will need Astrid, her literacy, her knowledge of the law, her aristocratic bearing, which allows her to speak to officials in a language they understand. Astrid understood. She said she was ready. The 30th day. Maeve came to Kyle at night. Everyone was asleep. She sat down next to him by the door, quietly, so as not to wake the others. She said she wanted to show him something. She took a bundle from her bosom. Old, worn, wrapped in oil-stained cloth. She unwrapped it. Inside was a notebook, thin, made of sewn-together sheets of parchment, covered in fine handwriting. The letters were strange, not the ones used in this world. A different alphabet, a different system. Maeve said it was her mother's notebook. Her mother was an herbalist, like Maeve, but better, much better. Her mother died when Maeve was 14. Before she died, she gave Maeve this notebook. She said there were recipes inside that could change everything. But Maeve can't read them. She's been carrying the notebook with her for 8 years. For 8 years, she's been trying to crack the code. She can't. She said she was showing the notebook to Kyle because he's the only person she trusts. Temperature 30. She didn't know about the numbers, but the numbers knew about her. Kyle took the notebook. He held it up to the light from the stove. He looked at the letters, and the world stood still. He recognized that handwriting. No, not handwriting. A writing system. It was shorthand, an old Norwegian shorthand that his grandfather used to write down smoking recipes. His grandfather said he'd learned it from his own grandfather, and that one from his, and so on, back through the centuries. Kyle sat in a dugout in a foreign world, in a foreign body, and looked at his grandfather's handwriting. At cursive that had come from this world into his world and returned 200 years later, having passed through 2 dead bodies. His great-great-grandmother, the one who had been burned for heresy in this village 200 years ago. She had been Maeve's mother's teacher, or her teacher's teacher, a chain of knowledge that had remained unbroken across 2 centuries and 2 worlds. Kyle began to read, slowly. The letters were hard to make out. He hadn't read his grandfather's shorthand. He'd listened. His grandfather had dictated, and Kyle had memorized it by ear. But the symbols were familiar. He deciphered them word by word. Recipes. Not just herbal infusions. Recipes of the hearth. Methods for retaining heat in the ground. Methods for growing winter crops. Fermentation methods he knew from his past life but adapted for this world, using local fungi, local herbs, and local strains of yeast that don't exist on Earth. Maeve sat beside him and watched as he read. She didn't ask any questions. She saw his face. She saw him recognize the letters. She saw his eyes widen. She didn't know why he could read what she couldn't, but she didn't ask. Not yet, anyway. Kyle read until dawn. Maeve fell asleep beside him. Her head rested on his shoulder. Light. Warm. Her breathing was steady. No coughing. Kyle kept reading. There were 43 recipes in the notebook. He'd managed to figure out 7, but among those 7 was one that would change everything. Winter miso. A fermented paste made from barley, fish, salt, and the fungus that Maeve had gathered for her potions. The fungus she'd considered medicinal was actually a fermenting agent. That very same aspergillus, the mold that makes miso. Kyle closed the notebook. He looked at Maeve, who was sleeping. He looked at the stove. He looked at the 4 women sleeping in his house, a house that had ceased to be a dugout and had become a home. He thought that the great-great-grandmother who had been burned at this very spot 200 years ago had left him instructions. She had left recipes. She had left a path. He thought that every time the lot was drawn at dawn, she was the one rolling the die. He didn't know for sure yet, but he could feel it. Just as a chef knows when the dough is ready, not by a timer, but by the smell, by the sound, by the way it responds to his touch. Dawn. The lot. Total heat 115. Result. Coffee beans. 10 of them. Kyle held them in the palm of his hand, Small, green, unroasted, useless for eating, priceless for trade. Because if you roast them right, grind them, and brew them, you'll get a drink this world has never tasted, and for which the aristocrats will pay in gold. The 33rd day. They came from the east. Not an army, worse, hungry. 40 people, men, women, and teenagers, ragged, armed with whatever they could find, axes, pitchforks, knives, one rusty sword. They were heading toward the smoke, toward the smell of smoked fish that carried for kilometers across the frozen plain. Una was the first to spot them. She had been hunting 3 hours' walk to the east. She saw the tracks, 40 pairs of feet, heading west, toward Oak Hollow. She ran back for 2 hours. She burst into the dugout. Her face was white, not from the cold, but from what she'd seen. She gestured wildly. "A lot of them. They're coming. Weapons!" Kyle understood immediately. He went out into the square. He found the village elder. He told him a gang was coming from the east. 40 men. They'd be here by nightfall. The village head turned pale. Then he flushed. Then he turned gray. He said the village had no weapons, no wall, no militia. He said they had to flee. Kyle said there was nowhere to flee to. To the south, it was a 3-day journey to the nearest settlement. The children and the elderly wouldn't make it. To the north lay the taiga and wolves. To the west, the river was frozen over. All that was left was to stand our ground. The village elder asked how. Kyle said he had a plan. He needed 4 hours, and everyone who could hold a stick. For the next 4 hours, Kyle worked faster than he ever had in his life. Faster than during rush hour in the kitchen. Faster than on mountain rescue missions. The greenhouse trenches became combat trenches. 1/2 meter deep, 1 meter wide. Kyle arranged them in a semicircle in front of the village. Between the trenches were stakes, sharp sticks driven into the snow at an angle. They won't kill, but they'll slow them down. Una was on the roof of the dugout, the best vantage point for firing. 3 arrows, Kyle counted them. 3 arrows for 40 people. Not enough. He found an old fisherman, asked if he had a harpoon. The fisherman brought 2. Heavy, made of bone, with serrated tips. Una tried them out. She nodded. From 20 paces away, she'll drive the harpoon into the chest. Wren. Kyle positioned her by the door of the dugout next to a cauldron of boiling fish oil. The oil is burning, the oil sears. Fat is a weapon for those who have no sword. Wren didn't flinch. She took the cauldron with both hands and said she was ready, without a smile, with the stony face of a woman who had been taught for 12 years to endure pain and who was now ready to inflict it. Maeve. Kyle gave her a task that made his own stomach clench. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and barley. Poisonous. In small doses, it causes convulsions and vomiting. In large doses, it kills. Maeve knew ergot. She knew how to harvest it and how to measure it out. She knew because a herbalist must know poisons in order to treat them. Kyle asked her to prepare an infusion, not lethal, just enough to induce vomiting, and to pour it into 3 wineskins filled with water. Leave the wineskins at the village entrance, in a conspicuous place. The hungry gang will see the water and drink it. In 20 minutes, half of them will be lying in the snow vomiting. Maeve looked at him. That's a long time. Then she nodded. She didn't ask why. She knew why. Because if 40 hungry, armed men entered the village, it wouldn't be them who died. The children would die. Red-haired Ellie would die. The old people would die. Everything they'd been building for 33 days would die. Astrid. Kyle had sent her to the basement under the village chief's house. The children were with her. All the children of the village. 12 of them. And the elderly who couldn't stand. Astrid commanded them calmly and clearly. She told each child where to sit and what to do if it got loud upstairs. She spoke the way people do who are used to the world falling apart. With a plan. Little Ellie sat next to her and held her hand. Astrid didn't let go. 20 men and women from the village stood in the trenches. With sticks, with stones, with pitchforks. The one-armed carpenter held an axe in his only hand and looked toward the east. His face was calm. He had survived 3 winters on his own. He wasn't afraid. They arrived at sunset, gray figures against the white snow. They spread out in a chain. Kyle stood in front of the trenches, alone, out in the open. He was waiting for them. The first 10 approached the water skins. They grabbed them. They drank greedily. Water with a hint of barley. They didn't detect the ergot. Kyle waited 15 minutes. Then he stepped forward and shouted. He said there was food in the village. He said he was willing to share. He said they wouldn't need weapons for that. The gang leader stepped forward. Tall, skinny, a scar across his entire face. He said he didn't believe him. He said sharing was a word for the well-fed. The hungry take what they need. He raised his hand. The gang moved forward. And at that moment, the first 10 began to fall. The ergot had struck. Vomiting, convulsions, they fell into the snow and writhed. The remaining 30 froze. The leader turned around. He saw his men on the ground. He turned to Kyle, his face contorted. He roared and charged forward. The rest followed him. 30 men ran through the snow toward the village. The first 3 ran into the stakes. 1 fell. 2 got around them. Una fired. First arrow. A man fell. Second arrow. Another one. The third. A miss. Una grabbed her harpoon. She threw it. A hit. The fourth. The rest reached the trenches. And the trenches came to life. 20 men from Oak Hollow rose from the snow with sticks, stones, and pitchforks. A blow, a scream, a crunch. The fight in the drink lasted 20 minutes. Kyle stood in the center. He held a stick in his hands, sharpened, heavy. One of them broke through to him, a young man with an axe, his eyes wild, hungry. He swung. Kyle struck first, with the stick to the chest. The guy fell, got back up. He swung again. Kyle struck again, in the head. The guy fell and didn't get up. Kyle stood over him, the stick in his hands, blood on the snow. He had killed a man, the first one in his life. His hands were shaking. His stomach churned. He bent over and threw up in the snow next to the body. The fight was over. The gang lost 22 men, killed, wounded, and poisoned. The remaining 18 fled back east. The village didn't lose a single man. Not a single one. 2 were wounded, cuts and bruises. Maeve was already there, bandaging and washing their wounds. Her hands didn't tremble. A healer in war. Kyle sat in the snow. He looked at the body of the guy he'd killed. Young, maybe 20 years old. Thin, hungry. Just as hungry as Kyle had been 33 days ago. He'd killed a man who wanted to eat. That thought pierced him like a knife and stayed with him. The system sent a notification. Radius of the hearth plus 2 miles. All wives plus 10 heat. Rank 4, manner. Kyle didn't look at the numbers. He stared at the blood on the stick and couldn't unclench his fingers. For 3 nights, Kyle couldn't cook. He sat by the stove and stared at his hands. Hands that had kneaded dough, sewn mittens, cleaned fish, and killed a man. He couldn't pick up a knife, couldn't pick up the pot, couldn't touch the food. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that guy's face. Young, thin, hungry. Eyes that held no malice, only hunger. The first night, Rin cooked for him. The broth turned out well, almost like his. She'd learned. The second night, Maeve cooked, porridge with her fish sauce. Everyone ate. Kyle didn't eat. On the third night, Una sat down next to him, silently. She placed an onion on the floor. She took off her mittens, the very ones he had sewn. She took hold of his wrist, his left one, the one that held the stick. Her fingers were cold, slender, calloused from the bowstring. She held his wrist and said nothing. She couldn't speak. She had said only one word in 6 years, and that word was his name. But now she didn't need words. She held his hand, and that was enough. Kyle sat there. Una held him. The minutes passed. The stove crackled. The wind howled outside the wall. 21 below. Then Una did something she'd never done before. She took his hand and placed it on the knife. A kitchen knife. The very same shard of stone he'd used to cut his first fish on the second day. She placed his fingers on the handle and looked him in the eyes. Her gaze said one thing: "You're a cook. A cook cuts. A cook feeds. You killed because you were defending those you feed. Now cut the onion, not yourself." Kyle gripped the knife. His hand was shaking. He picked up the onion. A wild onion. Small. Bitter. He began to chop. Tears started flowing. From the onion. And not just from the onion. He chopped and cried. And Una sat next to him, holding his elbow and not letting go. Maeve woke up to the sound of the knife on the stone. She raised her head. She saw Kyle and Una. She stood up. She walked over, sat down on the other side, rested her head on his shoulder, just like that night with the notebook. Wren woke up. She walked over, stood behind him, placed her hands on his shoulders. Warm, small. 3 women surrounding a man who was chopping onions and crying and couldn't stop doing either. Astrid was the last to wake up. She didn't come over, she sat in the corner and watched them. And in her eyes was what Kyle had seen in the square after the gathering, a mixture of envy and fear. But now there was more envy than fear. Kyle finished chopping the onion. He tossed it into the pot, added water, added fish, added Maeve's sauce, 3 drops, a pinch of salt. He cooked it for 30 minutes, ladled it into bowls, 5 of them, handed them out. He sat down. He ate. His hands were still shaking, but he ate. And he cooked. The chef returned to the kitchen. The system sent a notification. Una So plus 8 heat, current value 49. The threshold was 50 minus 1 point. Kyle looked at the number. 49. 1 point away from the point of no return. The point at which Una could no longer be lured, bribed, or intimidated. 1 point. He chose not to think about it. He thought about tomorrow. Day 37. 4 days until the tax. In the morning, Kyle examined the captive, the only one from the gang whom Una had wounded but not killed. He was lying in the shed, a wound in his shoulder. Maeve had bandaged it. He was conscious, young, skinny, a tattoo on his shoulder. Kyle looked at it and a chill ran down his spine. An ash-colored circle, the mark of the Order of Ash. He showed the tattoo to Astrid. Astrid turned pale. She said this wasn't a band of starving people. They were mercenaries. Sent, hired, paid. Someone had sent 40 men to destroy Oak Hollow, or to destroy Kyle. Kyle interrogated the captive. The man spoke willingly. He was one of those hired for food. He'd been told there was a heretic in Oak Hollow, that he was practicing sorcery with food, and that he had to be killed and the village plundered. He didn't know who'd hired them, just a man in a gray cloak with a staff. Kyle and Astrid exchanged glances. A staff, the symbol of the monks of the Order of Ash. The village headman didn't just write a letter. The letter reached its destination, and the order responded, not with an inspector, not with an investigation, with assassins. Kyle sat in the dugout and thought. The Order knows about him. The Order wants him dead, and the Order won't stop. Because Kyle is doing what the Order fears. He's bringing back warmth. He's feeding people. He's growing greens in winter. To an Order that sustains the long frost for the sake of obedience, a single cook with a magical stove is a greater threat than an army. Kyle looked at his hands, at the knife, at the cauldron. He's a cook, not a warrior, not a mage, not a hero, a cook. but a cook who feeds 80 people in winter, who grows turnips in his greenhouses, and who has 4 wives with a combined warmth of 145 and a hearth rank of 4. He looked at Astrid. He said he needed to know everything, about the order, about her father, about what happened 8 years ago. Astrid was silent for a long time. Then she spoke. She talked for 2 hours. Her voice was steady, no tears, facts, numbers, names. Her father, Count Marsh, was a member of the Royal Council. He discovered that the long frost was not a natural phenomenon, that it was sustained by the Order of Ash through a ritual, that beneath the capital, in the catacombs, lies the Heart of Ash, an artifact that draws heat from the earth and traps it, that the Order feeds the heart every year and the cold grows stronger, that if the heart were destroyed, the warmth would return. Count Marsh tried to convey this to the king. He was accused of treason. He was executed. The family was sent into exile. The documents proving the Count's innocence are hidden in the Marsh family crypt, a 2-day journey from Oak Hollow. Astrid knows where it is, but she can't go there alone. The Order's mercenaries are there. Kyle listened. Then he said they would go to the crypt, but not now. First, taxes. First, the auditor. First, a strong position. Then the crypt. Astrid looked at him. Something broke in her eyes. It wasn't a bad kind of break. It was good. Like ice breaking in the spring. She said quietly that for the first time in 8 years, she didn't feel alone. System. Astrid Marsh plus 7 heat. Current value 44. 41st day. Tax collection morning. Kyle stood in the village square. Astrid was beside him. Behind them were Maeve, Una, and Wren. Behind them were 20 villagers, the very ones who fished, smoked fish, and dug the greenhouses. A table stood in the square. On the table lay the tax, a sack of barley, 4 fox pelts, an iron ingot. Next to it, smoked fish, a pot of fish sauce, 3 sprigs of green turnip. The tax collector arrived on horseback, alone. He was fat, wearing a fur coat, with the district treasurer's seal around his neck. He dismounted. He looked at the table. He looked at Kyle. He looked at the green leaves. He walked over to the table. He picked up the hide. He crumpled it. He stroked it. Excellent quality. He set it down. He picked up the ingot. He weighed it. He nodded. He opened the sack. He scooped up some grain. Clean, sorted, not a single stone. He looked up at Kyle. Then he saw the smoked fish. He picked up a strip, sniffed it, took a bite, chewed slowly. His eyes went wide. He finished the strip. He took a second one. Then he saw the pot. He opened it. He sniffed it. He dipped his finger in. He tasted it. His face took on the expression people get when they taste something for the first time in their lives, something they never even knew existed. Then he saw the greens. He reached out his hand. He touched the leaves. Green. Alive. In winter. He looked at Kyle. Asked where they came from. Kyle said he'd grown them. The harvester asked how. Kyle said he'd show him if the harvester promised to report it to the higher-ups. The collector looked at him for a long time. Then he said he would report it. Kyle led him to the greenhouses. The collector stood over the trenches and looked at the turnips. 47 plants. Green. Sturdy. The root vegetables were already forming. The first harvest would be in a week. The collector stood there in silence. Then he said that in 20 years of traveling through the northern villages, he had never seen anything like it. He said he would report it. And he left. With the tax. With 3 strips of smoked fish in his pocket. With a sprig of green turnip tucked into his bosom like a treasure. Kyle watched him go. Astrid stood beside him. She said that now it would begin. Kyle said he knew. That same evening, there was a knock at the door of the dugout. Quiet. Cautious. Kyle opened it. A man stood on the threshold. Tall. Thin. In a gray hooded cloak. A staff. Wooden. With an ash-colored pommel. A monk of the Order of Ash. Kyle looked at the staff.
looked at the man, waited. The man pulled back his hood. A young face, 30, maybe 35. A shaved head. A scar on his chin. Tired eyes. He said his name was Brother Oswald. He said he had been sent by the order. He said he had to inspect the village and file a report on heresy. He said it quietly, without a threat, like a man doing a job he hates. Kyle looked at him. Then he looked at the blizzard behind him. 23 below, a northerly wind. Visibility, 10 paces. The monk was shivering. His lips were blue. Kyle said one word. "Come in." Oswald came in. He sat down by the stove. Kyle silently set the kettle on the stove. He scooped up some snow. He melted it. He took out the fish, 3 of them, the morning's catch. He cleaned them. He cut them up. He tossed them into the water. He added some wild onions, garlic, a bay leaf from the day before yesterday's draw, a pinch of salt, 3 drops of Maeve's sauce. He simmered it for 20 minutes. The aroma of the fish soup filled the dugout. Una stood by the wall, an onion in her hands, an arrow on the bowstring. She stared at the monk without blinking. Wren stood by the door with a knife. Maeve sat in the corner with a pot of sourdough starter pressed to her chest. Astrid sat across from the monk. She watched. She was silent. She waited. Kyle ladled the fish soup into a bowl. He handed it to Oswald. The monk took it with both hands. He brought it to his face. He inhaled. His eyes closed. He drank. Slowly, sip by sip. The broth was hot. The fish was tender. The onion was sweet from long simmering. The bay leaf imparted a fragrance unknown to this world. Maeve's sauce provided a depth that made something inside your stomach open up and tell you that you were home. Tears rolled down from beneath his shaved head, from beneath his hood, from beneath his weary eyes. They dripped into the bowl and mingled with the fish soup. Oswald was crying. Quietly, silently, just as Wren had cried when Kyle drew time over a rose. He was crying because the last time he'd eaten something hot was 3 days ago, because he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten something delicious, because the fish soup smelled just like it did in his mother's house when he was 6, and his mother was alive, and the world wasn't cold. He finished eating. He set down the bowl, wiped his face with his sleeve, looked at Kyle, raised his eyes. Kyle saw something in them, not gratitude, more than that. A crack. A crack in the wall the order had been building around this man for 10 years. 1 bowl of fish soup. 1 crack. Oswald spoke. He spoke quietly. The boy. They had already left the capital. There were 3 of them. They would be here in 12 days. Kyle asked who they were. Oswald said they were Magister Inquisitors, 3 of the 7, the cruelest, the most loyal. They weren't coming to investigate, they were coming to burn. Maeve clutched the pot tighter to her chest. Una drew her bowstring taut. Wren gripped her knife. Astrid closed her eyes. Kyle stood by the stove, a ladle in his hand. 12 days. 12 days. Kyle made use of every one. Day 1. He called a council. Not a gathering, a council. 5 people. Him, Astrid, the village elder, the old fisherman, the one-armed carpenter. He told them the truth. About the order, about the ashen heart, about the magisters who are coming. The village elder turned pale. He said he was the one who wrote the letter, that he didn't know it would turn out this way, that he thought an official would arrive, not executioners. Kyle said he knew. He said he wasn't angry. He said that now they needed to think together, not against one another. The village elder looked at him. The old man looked at the boy he'd considered trash just a month ago, and he nodded. Days 2 through 5. Kyle and Una set out for the Marsh's crypt. A 2-day journey. This time, Oswald was traveling with them,
a former monk. He knew the trails. He knew where the Order's outposts were. He knew how to get around them. Astrid gave them a map, drawn from memory, every turn, every rock. She'd been drawing it for 8 years, every night in her head, now on birch bark. The crypt stood in a rocky crevice halfway along the old road. 2 mercenaries stood at the entrance. Una took them both out from 30 paces away, silently. The arrow struck cleanly. Kyle wasn't throwing up anymore. He watched them fall and felt only heaviness, a heaviness that would remain forever. Inside the crypt, it was dark and cold, stone walls, an icy floor. The sarcophagi of the Marsh family, 6 generations. Kyle found the hiding place based on Astrid's description, the 3rd stone from the floor in the eastern wall. He pulled out the stone. Behind it was a niche. In the niche was a chest, small, oak, with a lock. Kyle broke the lock with a stone. Inside were documents, parchments bearing royal seals, letters between Count Marsh and 3 other lords, a map of the catacombs beneath the capital, a diagram of the ash heart, and a list. The names of the 7 masters of the Order, their weaknesses, their connections, their crimes. Count Marsh had been compiling this for years. He was preparing a strike. He didn't make it in time. Now his daughter would finish the job. They returned on the 5th day. Astrid met them at the outskirts. She stood upright, her hands at her sides, her face stony. Kyle handed her the chest. She took it, pressed it to her chest, closed her eyes. She stood like that for a minute. When she opened her eyes, they were dry. She said that now they had a weapon, not a sword, not a bow. The truth. The system. Astrid Marsh, plus 13 heat. Current value, 57. Threshold, 50, crossed. Irreversible. Astrid Marsh cannot be lured, bribed, or intimidated. Her loyalty to the hearth is absolute. Kyle looked at the notification, then at Astrid. She stood there holding her father's chest, and for the first time ever, she didn't look lonely. Days 6 through 10. Preparation. Kyle wasn't preparing for war, he was preparing a feast. 3 magisters will come to burn. They're waiting for the village to be gripped by fear. They're waiting for a man with a stick. They're waiting for a heretic they can burn and forget. They aren't waiting for a feast. Kyle had been preparing for 5 days. He used everything he knew from his past life and everything he'd read in his great-grandmother's notebook. Miso, the first batch, had ripened. Maeve had been monitoring the fermentation for weeks. She checked it every 4 hours. She fed the mold. She controlled the temperature. The mixture turned out thick, dark, with a scent that hit the nose and wouldn't let go. Umami in its purest form. Smoked fish. 3 kinds. Over alderwood. Over applewood from the orchard beyond the abandoned village of Greystone. Over pine chips for a smoky aroma. Bread. Kyle baked bread like he'd never baked before. Maeve's sourdough starter had become so strong that the dough doubled in size in an hour. He added fish oil to the dough, along with a pinch of wild garlic and dried berries that Una had found in the marsh. The bread turned out dark, dense, with a hint of tartness and sweetness and a third flavor that had no name. Turnips. The first harvest. 43 root vegetables. Small, white, sweet. Kyle roasted them in the embers, with salt, with a drop of fish sauce, with a sprig of thyme. Coffee. 10 beans. He roasted them on a stone, one by one, slowly, controlling the temperature with his fingers. The scent of coffee wafted through the dugout, and all 4 women lifted their heads at once. They didn't know what it was, but their bodies knew. Kyle's body remembered that scent, and through the system, through the hearth, through the bond that had been growing for 40 days, the memory passed to them as a shadow. Not in words, a scent. Wren was the first to say it smelled like morning. No one understood what she meant. Kyle understood. He ground the beans with a stone,
brewed them in a clay cup. A black liquid, bitter, thick. 1 cup. He didn't drink any himself. That cup was for guests. The 11th day, the day before. Kyle stood in front of the dugout, the village all around, smoke from the smokehouse, greenery in the greenhouses. Children played in the square. Red-haired Ellie was sliding down the hill on a rabbit pelt. People were walking between the houses with fish and bread. They were trading. They talked. They smiled. For the first time in 8 years, Oak Hollow looked like a village and not a survival camp. Kyle watched this and thought that tomorrow 3 people with magic and staffs would come to burn it all down. Because the Order cannot allow anyone to be well fed without their permission. Because hunger is their power. And the warmth Kyle had brought back to the earth within a 200-meter radius was the first crack in their world. Like the crack in Oswald caused by a single bowl of fish soup. Una approached. She stood beside him, silently. They stood and looked at the village. Then Una turned to him. She opened her mouth and spoke a sentence. The first complete sentence in 6 years. Her voice was hoarse, rusty. The words came slowly, like water through ice. "I'll shoot first. You second." Kyle looked at her. She stood upright, bow on her back, in his gloves. Her eyes were clear, fearless. She was speaking. She had chosen to speak. Not for herself, for him, the system. Una So plus 11, heat, current value 60, hidden card activated. Una So, daughter of the former captain of the Royal Guard, a guard tattoo on her thigh. Through it, access to an underground network of deserters. 19 people in 6 villages, ready for mobilization. Kyle read the notification. Then he looked at Una. She didn't know about the system, didn't know about the hidden card, but she had just given him an army, without knowing it. Simply by uttering her first sentence in 6 years. They arrived at dawn on the 53rd day, 3 of them, on horseback, in gray cloaks, with ashwood staffs, Magister Inquisitors of the Order of Ash. Cassian Ash rode at the head of the group, 40 years old, a handsome face, calm eyes. He was smiling, a polite smile, cold, like -20 behind his collar. The 2 behind him were silent, shadows in gray cloaks. The village froze. The children ran into their homes, the women shut the shutters. The men stood in their doorways with that expression people have when they know there's nothing they can do but can't bring themselves to leave. Kyle stood in the square, at the table. The table was set. 5 bowls, bread on a wooden board, 3 stacks of smoked fish, a pot of miso, roasted turnips, a clay cup with black liquid. Cassian dismounted. He looked at the table. He looked at Kyle. He said he had come in response to a report of heresy. He said it was his duty to inspect the village, question the residents, and compile a report. He said that if the heresy was confirmed, the village would be cleansed. In the Order's language, cleansed meant burned. Kyle nodded. He said he understood. He said that before the inspection, he suggested they have breakfast. It was a long journey. The morning was cold. Cassian looked at him, a hint of interest in his eyes. He sat down at the table. 2 magistrates stood behind him but did not sit down. They were his guards. Kyle passed him some bread. Cassian took a piece and examined it. It was soft, porous, and had a crust. He'd only seen bread like this in the capital, in the bakeries near the palace. He took a bite, chewed slowly. His expression didn't change. He'd been trained not to show any reaction. But Kyle saw how his jaw slowed on the 3rd chew, how his eyes narrowed slightly, how his fingers gripped the piece more tightly. The body cannot lie, not even an inquisitor's. Kyle handed him the fish smoked over alderwood. Cassian tasted it. He nodded, without a word.
Then the miso. Kyle ladled a spoonful into a bowl of hot broth. He stirred it. He handed it over. Cassian raised the bowl to his face. He inhaled. And that's when Kyle saw the first crack. Microscopic. Cassian's nostrils twitched. They widened. He inhaled again. Deeper. He didn't recognize this scent. No one in this world did. Umami. Fermented protein. A depth of flavor that existed only in Kyle's mind and in Maeve's pot. Cassian drank the broth. He set the bowl down. He looked at Kyle. He asked what it was. Kyle said it was miso. Cassian asked what miso was. Kyle said it was patient barley. Cassian didn't understand. Kyle said it was barley that had been given time to reflect on life. Cassian didn't smile, but he didn't frown either. He looked at Kyle with the kind of gaze one uses when looking at something that defies classification. Then Kyle served coffee. A cup. Just one. A black liquid. Hot. Bitter. With a scent unlike anything else in the entire kingdom. Cassian took the cup. He sniffed it. He took a sip. And for the second time that morning, his face twitched. Not much, but it twitched. He finished it, set the cup down, remained silent for 30 seconds. Then he said that Kyle was an interesting person. He said that interesting people are usually burned. Kyle said he knew. He said that was precisely why he was suggesting thinking rather than burning. He took out the documents from the Marsh's crypt, placed them on the table, in front of Cassian. Count Marsh's letters, a list of the 7 masters, their crimes, a map of the Ashen Heart, a map of the catacombs. Cassian looked at the documents. His face became expressionless, like a mask. He read them, every single page, slowly. Then he looked up and asked where they came from. Astrid stepped out from behind Kyle. Her back was straight. Her chin was raised. Count Marsh's daughter. She said this was her father's legacy, that her father was no traitor, that the order had killed him because he had learned the truth, and that now the truth lay on the table before the Master Inquisitor, who could choose: burn the village and bury the truth, or take the truth to the capital and become the man who broke the order from within. Cassian looked at Astrid, then at Kyle, then at the documents. He was silent for a long time, a minute, 2. The crack within him was no longer microscopic. It was visible. The coffee, the miso, the bread, and the truth on the parchments were all working together. Cassian sincerely believed that hunger was a blessing, that a well-fed person forgets God. But now he was sitting there, full for the first time in weeks, and he hadn't forgotten God. He remembered him more clearly than ever, because Kyle's food didn't make him forget. It made him remember. Remember his mother. Remember home. Remember who he was before the order took him at age 10 and taught him that warmth was a sin. Cassian stood up. He folded the documents, put them in his bag. He looked at Kyle. He said the village was clean. No heresy detected. The report would be drafted accordingly. He turned to the 2 behind him. They looked at him in confusion. He said one word to them. "Let's go." They drove off. 3 gray figures against the white snow. Kyle watched them go. Astrid stood nearby. She was trembling, not from the cold, but because 8 years of waiting had come to an end at this very table. She turned to Kyle. She looked at him for a long time. Then she called him by name. Kyle. For the first time, without the word peasant, for the first time as an equal. Maeve approached. Una approached. Wren approached. 4 women stood around the table, on which an empty coffee cup and breadcrumbs remained. Kyle looked at them. At Maeve, who 2 months ago had been coughing up blood and now grew miso and talked to plants. At Una, who had been silent for 6 years and now spoke in full sentences and smiled and shot without. At Wren, who had worn a dead smile for 12 years but now cooked broth with fish sauce and didn't smile when she didn't want to. At Astrid, who for 8 years had been the daughter of a traitor but was now the daughter of a hero, with proof in her hands. And behind them, the village. Smoke from the smokehouse, greens in the greenhouses, children in the square. red-haired Ellie, who ran to the greenhouse every morning and touched the turnip leaves with her fingers because greens were a miracle to her. Kyle looked at the ground around the hut. Within 200 meters, the snow was melting. Slowly, barely noticeably, but it was melting. Drops were falling from the roof. The ground was emerging from beneath the white. Dark, wet, alive, for the first time in 8 years. Nowhere else in Heimskar was the snow melting. Only here, only around his hearth. Grass was peeking out from under the snow. Green, thin, the first in 8 years. Ellie saw it. She ran over. She got down on her knees. She touched it with her fingers. She looked up at Kyle. Her eyes were huge. She asked what it was. He said it was grass. She asked, "And what is grass?" He said it was what the world grows from. Ellie stroked the blade of grass, gently, as if it were a living thing. The other children ran over. They knelt down beside her. 12 children who had never seen grass in their lives were kneeling on the wet ground, touching the green blades with their fingers and saying nothing, because a miracle needs no words. Kyle stood on the porch. 4 women stood beside him. Little Leah was in Ren's arms, an orphan from a neighboring village, 9 years old. He had saved her during a raid. She clung to Ren and looked at the grass and the children. Astrid stood to the right. She looked at the melting snow, at the grass, at the children. She said quietly that he understood what he had done. Kyle said he had made soup. Astrid looked at him. For a second, irritation flashed across her face. Then a smirk. Then a smile. Astrid Marsh's first real smile in 8 years. Una stood to the left. Her bow was behind her back, in his mittens. She wasn't looking at the snow or the grass. She was looking at him, and silently she took his hand. Maeve stood slightly behind them. Her head was leaning against his shoulder, a habit that had become a ritual. She was holding a pot of sourdough starter. Barbara II. That's what Kyle had called her to himself, in honor of the first one, who had died in the refrigerator in another life. Ren stood with Leah without a smile, her face genuine. Calm. Warm. Alive. On her shoulder, under her shirt, was a sprig of thyme over a rose. A garden over the brand. The system issued the day's final notification. Total family warmth, 247. Hearth rank, 5. Fort. Hearth radius, 20 miles. Spells of fear do not work within this radius. Poisonings are not fatal. Women in labor do not die. The first seal of the ashen heart cracked. 799 remaining. Kyle read it. 799. A distant bell from the capital rang out at the edge of his hearing. Quiet, faint, like a crack in a wall that had stood for 200 years. Kyle looked at the 4 women beside him, at the children on their knees in front of the grass, at the village from which smoke rose and the smell of bread wafted. He wasn't building a country. He was building a kitchen with enough room for everyone. 1 snow had melted. 7,999 remained.